Chapter 15:18, Nearing the Ninth Reincarnation. Rumbling sounds echoed out as the essence of space of the eighth hex descended and locked everything in place. Space was sealed, the air was sealed, everything was sealed. Even the beam of light lurched to a halt. Meng Hao strode forward, completely ignoring the light and the destructive power that filled it as he stepped inside. The light washed over him, distorting a moment before being blasted away. Meng Hao stepped onto the spell formation, reached out, and grabbed the half-transparent Hanbei. Almost as soon as his hand latched onto her, she laughed bitterly. "If you kill me, Chu Yuyan dies," she shrieked. Even as her words echoed out and before she could speak another sentence, Meng Hao's face turned icy cold. Without the slightest hesitation, he snapped her neck. Hanbei couldn't believe what was happening as a boom rang out, and she exploded into a haze of blood and gore. She had been destroyed in body and mind. "This isn't your true self," Meng Hao said coolly. "Only a tool to be discarded, or perhaps a clone to be used as a seed for rebirth. Now that I've killed this body, I'm curious to see what other means you will use to try to evade my wrath." He closed his eyes as he followed the aura of Hanbei's flesh and blood to try to track her down yet again. Hanbei was crafty to the extreme, and had prepared many life-saving backup plans. Strangely, even Meng Hao was having trouble detecting the signs of where exactly she had teleported away to. He had followed various clues to this place and found her clone. Hanbei was certainly clever. Clearly, her true self and her clone had fled in different directions. If Meng Hao ended up following her clone, then that would suit her plans nicely. If he followed her true self, then the clone could make its escape and be the seed for rebirth if he ended up killing her true self. "Gotcha," he said, eyes flickering as he looked off into the distance. There, his divine sense had spotted a figure who hadn't been there moments ago. It was the fleeing figure of Hanbei's true self. Her hair was in disarray, and her face was ashen. She seemed shocked, in disbelief, as if she could never have imagined that Meng Hao would have the mental fortitude to survive and track her down from outside the vast expanse. It really seemed impossible to her. No one could survive the experience of going outside the vast expanse, especially not immortals who had transformed into demons. He wasn't assimilated and wasn't consumed. He's still himself. He didn't become the emissary of all heaven. How did he do it? Damn it. A tremor ran through Hanbei as she thought about Meng Hao's raging, murderous aura. She could well imagine that Meng Hao's heart was completely fixed on the notion of slaughtering her. Furthermore, she had no desire to test out whether Meng Hao had slipped into a state where he didn't care about Chu Yuyan's soul. If he had, Hanbei knew that he could kill her as easily as flipping over his hand. "There's no way he doesn't care about her," she thought, gritting her teeth. As she flew along, suddenly, one of the cities of the mortal world appeared in front of her. When Meng Hao realized what direction she was flying in, his pupils constricted. Beyond the mountains on the horizon was the city where his clone's ninth reincarnation was living. There, on the sprawling plains, was the enormous capital city of the mortal empire. Meng Hao had very little connection to this ninth reincarnation. He could sense him, but that was all. And yet, that sensation allowed him to pinpoint exactly where the clone was located. That didn't help him to check the clone's current situation, though. Not even divine sense revealed anything more than a blurry haze. However, he could sense a familiar aura brewing within his clone's ninth reincarnation. It was the complete aura of the ninth hex, an aura which could change all lives in unpredictable ways. It was an aura that could cover over all life, that twisted the air, making divine sense impossible to penetrate the area. How does Hanbei know where my clone's ninth reincarnation is? Could it be just random chance? His eyes glittered brightly. Of course, he had no idea that Yanner had become a part of his clone's ninth life. It was only because Hanbei was connected to Chu Yuyan's soul that she was going in that direction. She had no idea of knowing that his clone's reincarnation was obscuring the divine sense in Chu Yuyan's area. However, she was able to determine the general location. And therefore, she was speeding there to try to track Chu Yuyan down. Even as Hanbei sped along, Meng Hao let out a cold harumph and blurred into motion as he gave chase. Rumbling sounds filled heaven and earth. Hanbei was moving so quickly that she was soon in the air above the capital city where the clone's reincarnation lived. This must be the place, she thought, face gleaming with delight. This was her final life-saving backup plan. She knew that even if she fled to the farthest corners of the vast expanse, Meng Hao would still be able to track her down. Furthermore, because of the injuries she had sustained, it was impossible for her to safely summon the will of all heaven upon her. Therefore, Her final chance at survival lay with Chu Yuyan. She hoped that, in the case that Meng Hao had lost himself in his hatred, suddenly seeing Chu Yuyan in the flesh would awaken him. Unfortunately, even though she knew Chu Yuyan's general location, she couldn't pinpoint exactly where she was. She only knew that she was in this city, which was somehow covered with a blanket of obscurity. However, she had no way of knowing that the closer she got to her target, the stronger Meng Hao's killing intent grew. After all, how could he possibly allow anything bad to happen to his clone? Even as Han Bei arrived outside the mortal city, sounds like muffled thunder filled the air. Suddenly, the air seemed to rip apart, and Meng Hao emerged to hover in front of Han Bei. His eyes were icy cold, and his killing intent swirled madly. Han Bei suddenly shivered and began to pant. Apparently, Meng Hao's appearance provoked a reaction from the clouds up above. More thunder crackled, breaking the clouds open and causing rain to begin to fall. Moments later, the lands were soaked in rain. Countless mortal citizens in the city scurried about to get out of the rain. It was currently evening, and as the sky darkened, the rain began to fall even harder. In a narrow alley in one particular corner of the city was a carpenter's shop. Little Treasure sat there, carving a piece of wood, relying on his memory to sculpt the shape he remembered. Outside, thunder rumbled and the sound of rainfall could be heard. Normally speaking, those sounds would stir his imagination and make him think about what it might look like outside. But today he felt uneasy, as though something important were about to happen. Soon he heard footfalls behind him. It was his wife, who sat down next to him and leaned on his shoulder. A smile broke out on his face, and suddenly the uneasy feeling in his heart gave way to calmness. His wife looked at him warmly and also smiled. Her belly appeared to be slightly swollen. A tiny little life was there inside, slowly growing. Because of the blanket of obscurity, Meng Hao's true self was unaware of what had occurred in his clone's ninth life. At the same time, the person who had accompanied that reincarnation through life had no way to detect the familiar aura which existed beyond that obscurity. "If you kill me, Chu Yuyan's dead," Han Bei said shrilly. She was nervous and very afraid. Thunder crashed and the rain fell. Meng Hao didn't use his cultivation base to prevent the rain from touching him. He hovered there in the air, eyes swirling with killing intent, and as the rain landed on him, it turned into ice which fell down toward the ground. Meng Hao looked over at Han Bei, then said, "The first time we met was when we went into the Black Civ sect's ancient blessed land." His eyes flickered with memories. In the past, he would never intentionally take the time to indulge in nostalgia. But as the years went by, he grew more lonely and then experienced the destruction of the mountain and sea realm. Eventually, he reached the point where he would reminisce. If it were possible, he would prefer that all of the people who had once been his friends not perish. That was especially true of those he killed himself. He felt that way about Chen Fan, and also felt that way about Han Bei. Han Bei looked back at him quickly, eyes flickering with mixed emotions as she thought back to the past. Then Meng Hao's eyes shone with bright light. What he had said just now had been 70% sincere and 30% duplicitous. He truly had been sighing, but the intention had been to cause Han Bei to think about the past. In the blink of an eye, Meng Hao's right hand flashed with an incantation gesture. Karmic hexing appeared, and the wave of a finger caused Han Bei to begin to tremble. All of her karma threads appeared above her head, from which Meng Hao extracted a single thread. It was none other than the karma thread, which connected her to Chu Yuyan. At the same time, Meng Hao's hand slashed through the air. The pieces of ice which had fallen off of him moments ago suddenly flew through the air, transforming into countless sharp blades that flashed through the air toward Han Bei. More precisely, they shot toward the karma thread which connected her to Chu Yuyan. Han Bei's eyes widened and she gasped. She immediately fell back, hands flashing in a double-handed incantation gesture. Then she shoved her hands out, unleashing the power of her cultivation base. However, she was not even close to being a match for Meng Hao. In the blink of an eye, the chunks of ice were directly in front of her and on the verge of slashing through her body. In that moment, she shrieked. Her black pupils rapidly extended outward until they had overtaken the whites of her eyes. A boundless will then began to emanate out from her. It was the will of all heaven, and as it exploded out, blood oozed out of the corners of her mouth. She began to shake violently, and the sounds of breaking bones echoed out from inside of her. Chapter 15:19 Han Bei perishes. In order to send Meng Hao outside the vast expanse, Han Bei had paid the heaviest of prices. She had harmed herself on a fundamental level in order to summon the will of all heaven. As such, when she did so again, she could barely prevent herself from collapsing into pieces. However, even as her body began to fall apart, she was able to wield astonishing power. Blood oozed out of the corners of her mouth as her internal organs were destroyed. And yet, she raised her right hand toward the incoming ice fragments and pushed out. Rumbling could be heard as the ice lurched to a halt. Then, each and every one exploded, forming a mist. That mist then congealed into the form of an arrow. Han Bei's eyes glinted with a cruel light as she prepared to send the arrow flying back at Meng Hao. But then her face fell as she realized that Meng Hao had vanished. Before she could even spin around, Meng Hao had appeared behind her. She had no time to unleash any divine abilities or set up any defenses. Meng Hao's eyes flickered as he waved his right hand, summoning the copper mirror. It had a huge crack running down the middle, but it was still the same precious treasure it had always been. The parrot materialized, letting out a fierce squawk. At the same time, the surface of the mirror floated out, and of the 9 pieces which comprised it, one shot out and stabbed into the middle of Han Bei's back. Even still, Han Bei's energy continued to rise and the boundless will continued to pour into her. She performed an incantation gesture with her right hand, then pointed behind her, causing the air around Meng Hao to shatter. A blast of energy then separated them, whereupon Meng Hao vanished again. When he reappeared, he was in a different location, where he waved his hand, sending a second mirror shard stabbing into Han Bei's forehead. Blood oozed out of the corners of her mouth as she performed another incantation gesture. The lands below began to quake, and crevices snaked out. However, that was when the third mirror shard stabbed into her, and then the fourth. Han Bei's pupils constricted. She could already sense that the connection between her own soul and Chu Yuyan's was being destroyed. Backing up, she performed yet another incantation gesture. Blood sprayed out of her mouth, transforming into a blood-colored palm print that shot toward Meng Hao. She was now in full retreat, drawing upon all the speed she could muster to flee. She was filled with the intense premonition that these copper mirror shards had the capacity to completely end her life. However, even as she tried to escape, Meng Hao's eyes flickered with scorn. His right hand flashed with an incantation gesture, causing numerous mountains to appear, which fell down and completely blocked off her path of retreat. From a distance, it almost appeared as if those mountains were descending from the heavens. Han Bei let out a miserable shriek and then slammed into the mountains. The mountains shattered, and just when she appeared to be on the verge of making her escape, Meng Hao appeared next to her. He waved his right hand, and the 5th, 6th, and 7th mirror shards stabbed into Han Bei. Han Bei's face was pale, and within her, the power of the will of all heaven had exploded out in full force. She even went so far as to use the same magical technique that Chen Fan had used, causing numerous battles to fill Meng Hao's memories. However, Meng Hao was prepared for that. His right hand flashed with an incantation gesture, and massive power erupted out within him. It was karmic hexing, which instantly severed her karma. Then the 8th mirror shard stabbed into her chest. She chuckled bitterly. By this point, her connection to Chu Yuyan's soul was almost completely gone. Glaring at Meng Hao, she gritted her teeth and unexpectedly chose to detonate her own soul. "Maybe I'll vanish forever," she said, her eyes burning with madness, "but at least I can leave your heart in agony." A boom echoed out as the power of the detonation began to explode out. "Too late," Meng Hao said coolly. He waved his hand, and the 9th mirror shard whistled through the air at an impossible speed. Han Bei couldn't have blocked it even if she had tried. It stabbed directly into her Danshan region. "Soul severing," Meng Hao said quietly. The parrot squawked, shooting toward Han Bei at top speed. Simultaneously, the mirror shards exploded. Meng Hao had set out completely intent on killing Han Bei. Even though her soul was linked with Chu Yuyan's, after acquiring the copper mirror, he knew that he could separate the two of them. The main danger would be if Han Bei chose to self-detonate, which was something he couldn't prevent. Therefore, he didn't immediately attack Han Bei with full force. Instead, he had intentionally talked about past times, all to provoke the flow of memories within Han Bei's eyes. In that moment when she recalled the past, he unleashed karmic hexing as a tactic to sever her soul. Severing karma wouldn't be enough to undo her fusion with Chu Yuyan's soul. Everything he had done before had been a feint. His true goal was to use the copper mirror and the parrot to completely separate their souls. The parrot's squawk echoed out at the same time that the 9 mirror shards began to explode. The parrot then pierced through Han Bei's body, which was a simple thing considering it wasn't using its corporeal form. As it passed through her, it latched its beak down onto a strand of soul, which was none other than the piece of Chu Yuyan's soul which was nestled inside of Han Bei's soul. The blurry soul fragment began to stretch out as it was pulled inexorably away from Han Bei's soul. It was in that moment that the full power of the detonation of the mirror shards surged out. 9 separate explosions ripped through Han Bei, slashing at the point where the two souls connected. Han Bei let out a blood-curdling scream as her soul was severed from Chu Yuyan's. A massive boom echoed out as the parrot soared through the air, circling back around to Meng Hao with Chu Yuyan's soul fragment. As for the mirror shards, they reformed and floated back to the copper mirror, where they once again became an intact mirror face. As of this moment, Meng Hao's desire to kill Han Bei had not lessened at all. He shot forward to appear directly in front of her, whereupon he unleashed a fist strike. A boom rang out as Han Bei's body exploded into a cloud of gore. Her soul flew out into the air, where she stared at Meng Hao, smiling bitterly. "Meng Hao, you've really surprised me. You truly deserve to be the son of All Heaven. The blood of the All Heaven clans runs strong in you. However, your fate is sealed. The fate of all the starry sky of All Heaven is sealed. It can't be changed. Nobody can alter it." She began to laugh bitterly. Her soul was so damaged because of calling upon the will of All Heaven that Meng Hao didn't need to do anything to it now. She was like an oil lamp on the verge of sputtering out. Her soul trembled as cracks began to spread out across its surface. Soon, she was completely fragmented and was apparently on the very brink of falling apart. "Tell me, what are the All Heaven clans?" Meng Hao suddenly asked. You already know. What need have you of further proof?" "Well, I guess it doesn't matter now. All Heaven clans are forged from the bloodline of the will of All Heaven. They were scattered among the starry sky with the sole purpose of helping the will of All Heaven to climb back to the pinnacle. In this life, I am the daughter of All Heaven, and you are the son of All Heaven. Things between us aren't over yet." Her laughter grew louder and louder until her soul couldn't sustain itself any longer. A boom like thunder echoed out as she exploded into ash. Meng Hao hovered there quietly. After returning from outside of the vast expanse, he had already come to many conclusions about certain matters. Sighing, he looked up into the heavens, his eyes glittering. Eventually, Jin Yunshan, the sect leader, and the others appeared. They hovered there quietly, hearts battered by waves of shock. The bizarre performance put on by Han Bei, the unexpected appearance of the will of All Heaven, and Meng Hao's incredible power left them all panting. Eventually, they clasped hands and bowed to Meng Hao, then began to depart in beams of colorful light. The last to leave was the sect leader. He looked at Meng Hao with mixed emotions, then glanced thoughtfully at the spot where Han Bei had vanished. Finally, he clasped hands and left. After they were gone, Meng Hao looked down at Chu Yuyan's soul strand. The parrot was perched on his shoulder. After a long moment, Meng Hao murmured, "Han Bei was right. I've known the truth for some time now. There is a will outside the vast expanse called All Heaven. In the past, All Heaven created the world, created life, and created cultivation. He is like the Lord of all things. But he grew weak and eventually reached the point of death. His body began to vanish, and in the end, all that remained were 5 fingers. Those fingers represent the immortal, the ghost, the god, the devil, and the demon. Every time one of them appears, it pushes All Heaven closer to death. Those fingers represent his life, an entity which exists above the heavenly Tao and is the will of all things. As for why All Heaven fears the immortal, perhaps there are many answers, but regardless, if the immortal appears, it will take the power of his life and become strong to an unimaginable degree. In fact, if the immortal appears, All Heaven will die instantly. When the immortal is about to appear, worlds are destroyed. When Patriarch Vast Expanse was about to become the immortal, the will of All Heaven intervened and destroyed the Vast Expanse land masses. From then on, Patriarch Vast Expanse was not the immortal but instead the ghost. Back when I was fleeing with the mountain and sea butterfly, I encountered that old man and he told me all of this. Way back then. 1. Meng Hao met the old man outside the vortex in chapter 1404. In Patriarch Vast Expanse's grief, he transformed the land masses into his necropolis, then went outside the vast expanse to destroy All Heaven's finger. That was all he could do, as he was not strong enough to kill All Heaven himself. Chapter 1520, Sculpt the Heavens. After that came the devil and the god. They also destroyed one of the All Heaven's fingers each. I wonder if the 3 of them were working together to completely destroy All Heaven, but just weren't able to pull it off. In any case, they were waiting for the demon to appear. I wonder where they got the idea that the demon could put an end to All Heaven. All heaven was waiting too, though, fearful of each person who approached the status of the immortal, waiting for demonic chi to appear inside of them. Then, just before they completed the process and became the true demon, he absorbed those quasi-demons, consumed them, used the multifariousness of the demon and their nirvanic rebirth to give himself new life. Perhaps the All-Heaven clans really were created by the blood of All-Heaven, and yet they were also clans which could give birth to the demon. My fate is like that of a demon, and I am the true demon. Meng Hao sighed. Perhaps his understanding wasn't complete, but after everything he had experienced, he was sure that it was 70 to 80% true. That is the origin of Song Dayazi and the other 97 faces. They were from different worlds of the past, and they all became quasi-demons. And I am the 99th. I was prepared by All Heaven to be the last of the group. He shook his head and hovered there silently for a long moment. The rain ceased to fall, and the moon was now visible, hanging in the sky. As it cast its light down onto the lands below, the reflection cast within the puddles was the picture of beauty. Meng Hao eventually made his way through the night into the city of mortals down below. Following the tuggings of his senses, he walked through the streets until he found himself at a certain street corner, leading into a small alley. Deep within the alley was a small shop. The door was closed, but based on the sign, and the woodpile outside, it was obvious that it was the shop of a carpenter. This was the home of his clone's 9th reincarnation. Meng Hao stood there for a long time. The obscuring mist which seemed to cover the area was strong here, as was the sensation that something was brewing that could shake the heavens. After a long moment passed, Meng Hao sent his divine sense out in an attempt to see what was in the shop. However, that was as effective as throwing a stone ox into the ocean. He could see nothing. A moment later, he vanished. When he reappeared, he was inside the carpenter's shop, looking around at the neatly arranged carpentry tools. There were also rows upon rows of little wooden sculptures, which left Meng Hao a bit taken aback. There were birds, dogs, cats, all of them remarkably lifelike. They were so lifelike, in fact, that it seemed as if they might start walking around at any moment. They even seemed to glow with a faint light that no mortal would be able to detect. It was the light of life, and it was very strong. It was like a life force that wasn't present in the wood itself, but which had been imparted unto it by means of the act of sculpting. Meng Hao simply couldn't imagine what hands would be capable of sculpting such lifelike statues. It was at this point that his eyes came to rest on one particular little sculpture which depicted a woman. A tremor ran through him, and his eyes went wide. He almost couldn't believe what he was seeing. It felt as if lightning bolts were crashing in his mind. From the look in his eyes, it was as if he were looking at something so outlandishly preposterous that it defied imagination. How is this possible? Why would my clone's 9th reincarnation have sculpted her? His heart began to thump as he realized that certain shocking and irreversible developments must have occurred during this 9th life. It was in that very moment that he heard footsteps behind him. A middle-aged man emerged from the room in the back of the shop. He was blind, and yet was able to walk as confidently as if he still possessed his eyes. He seemed very familiar with the little shop, as if it had been carved into his mind. He walked over to the middle of the shop and took a sculpting knife off of the shelf, then sat down and began to work on an unfinished sculpture. The sculpture wasn't even half complete, and although no one else would be able to see what it was, Meng Hao could tell at a glance that it was the 9th sealing mark of the 9th hex. Little Treasure couldn't see Meng Hao, and didn't know that he was there with him. If a picture could be painted of the scene, it would depict Meng Hao standing there in front of his clone's 9th reincarnation, looking down at him, slowly carving away at the block of wood. A very strange feeling filled Meng Hao's heart as he watched his 9th reincarnation. This reincarnation was different from the others. From the 2nd life to the 8th, Meng Hao had been able to observe what was happening, and even felt a sense of familiarity with the various reincarnations. He could sense that this was definitely his clone. His soul and his blood had both come from Meng Hao, but this 9th reincarnation felt very unfamiliar. Time passed in which Meng Hao simply watched the clone working with the sculpture. He had never seen the 9th sealing mark take shape in such a way, in such a clear and corporeal fashion. It had always appeared as an outline in his mind and heart, but this time, in the hands of Little Treasure, it was taking physical shape in the world, one knife stroke at a time. So this is my final 9th life, Meng Hao murmured. He stood there for a long time, until a woman walked out of the room. She couldn't see Meng Hao any more than Little Treasure could, but as soon as Meng Hao saw her, he understood why Han Bei had been coming to this location. Yanner, he murmured to himself with a sigh. After seeing Yanner depicted in the wooden sculpture, he had begun to suspect the truth, but to see her here in the flesh caused complicated emotions to rise up within him. Now he understood that in this ninth life, an unexpected twist had occurred. His clone had ended up marrying Chu Yuyan. Her belly was swollen with child, and her expression was warm as she placed a thick coat onto her husband's shoulders. Then she sat next to him, watching him sculpt. From the way she watched him, it seemed she would never tire of sitting there like that, not for her entire life. Eventually she looked down at the sculpture, and when she couldn't tell exactly what it was, she quietly asked, "Is it almost finished?" "Not yet," Little Treasure replied, rubbing the wood gently. "It's about a third done." She looked at it a bit closer and then asked, "What exactly is it? I can't tell." Little Treasure smiled and replied, "These are the heavens as I see them." "The heavens?" The woman looked a bit surprised. "Yeah, these are the heavens with their eyes closed, like me, unable to see." Little Treasure sighed. Yanner sat there quietly. Suddenly, Little Treasure looked up, and although he couldn't see Meng Hao, it was almost as if he were looking at him. "Yanner, sometimes I have the feeling that this is my purpose in life. It was foreordained that I be blind, to live in a world of darkness. But I want the heavens to open their eyes. It's too bad that I can't reach up and touch them." Meng Hao looked at Little Treasure and Yanner for a long moment. Finally, he sighed and turned to leave. Before walking out of the shop, he looked back at Yanner and the little bump on her belly. He could sense the life inside, and although it was true that the child inside was the offspring of his clone's ninth reincarnation, it was also true that it was his own flesh and blood. This ninth reincarnation was unlike any of the other lives, and this child was also different. Meng Hao stood at the threshold of the door, his expression one of many mixed emotions. He did nothing to interfere with the lives of Yanner and Little Treasure. There was no need. He had chosen to let both of them go, and therefore, he would not break them apart now. Because of the matter of the ninth hex, this ninth reincarnation apparently had keen intuition, to the point where Meng Hao was left shocked. Not only was he actually carving out the ninth seal of the ninth hex, he had uttered words which were thought-provoking even to Meng Hao. "How can you seal the heavens without being able to see them?" he murmured, shaking his head. "No, there's more to it than that. People think that he can't see the heavens, but the truth is that, in his world of blindness, he can see them. He is sculpting those heavens, one knife stroke at a time. The ninth seal represents those heavens. When that sculpture of his is complete, my clone's ninth reincarnation will close his eyes and pass away. The purpose of his life has been to sculpt that ninth sealing mark." Meng Hao walked quietly off into the distance. He didn't leave the city of mortals. He bought a house some distance away from Little Treasure and Yanner's, where he waited for his clone's ninth reincarnation to finish his work. 8 months passed in the blink of an eye, and Little Treasure became father to a baby girl. She wasn't blind. She could see the world in all its multitudinous colors. Her bright, cheerful laughter often filled the house. Her mother picked her name, a single character which meant perfection. From the time she was born, her parents called her Perfect. It was a bit of a strange-sounding name, but Little Treasure liked it, and so did Yanner. Little Treasure was extremely excited from the moment she was born. He often held his tiny daughter in his arms and laughed with joy. Later, he carved his daughter's likeness into wood, which he placed on the headboard of her bed. A few years later, Little Treasure's daughter was 8 years old, and the ninth sealing mark was about half finished. On that day, a white hair appeared on Little Treasure's head. Soon after, young Perfect snuck up behind him, then pounced on him, laughing with joy. Chuckling, Little Treasure scooped her up into his arms, and suddenly, Perfect spotted the white hair on her father's head. "Daddy, you have a white hair. Don't move, I'll pluck it out for you." She reached out with her little hand, found the white hair, and plucked it out. Little Treasure stroked his daughter's cheek and gave her a loving smile. He was happy, blessed even. The years continued to pass. Chapter 15:21. The Heavens Inflict Punishment. A year later, in the dead of night, Little Treasure was in the middle of sculpting the statue that was the ninth sealing mark. Suddenly, the sculpture glimmered with a faint light. It was now half complete. It was in that very moment that thunder rumbled in the sky outside. It filled the first continent, as if some powerful will were expressing its anger by roaring in rage. The heavens seemed to transform into an eye which scoured the lands below it, as if it were searching for something. In the end, the eye vanished. Even as the clouds above seethed, Meng Hao's true self was sitting in his home, not too far away from Little Treasure. He slowly looked up into the sky, his eyes cold. In that moment, Little Treasure couldn't shake the feeling that someone up above in the sky was looking down at him. He looked up, but of course, couldn't see anything. That night as the clouds churned, rain began to fall. It fell not just on that particular city but upon the entire first continent. Rain was a natural occurrence, so people didn't pay much attention to it. The mortals didn't even care, much less the cultivators. But the rain continued to fall for a total of 7 days. Because of the unending downpour, some low-lying areas began to fill up with water. A disaster was unfolding. Soon, the mortal empire began to get nervous and started taking measures to control the flood of water. The rain didn't stop after 7 days, though. There was a brief respite with a bit of sunny sky, but then thunder boomed and the rain began to fall again. It seemed to pour down without end. Rain fell for a second week, then a third, then a fourth. Then a second month, a third, and a fourth. Normally, a bit of rainfall was nothing anyone would worry about. But when the rain continued to fall for month after month, soaking the lands, completely inundating them, it was a completely different matter. By now, it was a true disaster, to the point where the cultivators in the first continent attempted to intervene and stop the rain. However, not even the paragons were capable of doing so. The best they could do was create canals that led the rainwater to the oceans. However, that was not a long-term solution. Furthermore, many of the cultivators who attempted to intervene would subsequently make critical errors when practicing cultivation, and then die. It was almost as if they had offended the will of the heavens, and were being punished with death. The mortal world was completely saturated with water. The city Little Treasure lived in was no exception. Certain portions of the city wall were so soaked that they had collapsed, as had many buildings throughout the city. The citizens could do little more than brave the downpours to try to bolster their residences against the rain. It reached the point where virtually no one was able to prevent the water from flowing into their homes. As the water rose, sickness and disease spread. Little Treasure's house was one of the few in which it was relatively dry. He had no idea why that was the case, nor did his daughter. Only his wife knew. She had taken certain measures to protect her family. "When is this rain going to stop?" Little Treasure said with a sigh. Because of what had been happening, business had ground to a halt. Thankfully, they had some food saved up, but if the rain kept on the way it was, that food wouldn't last for very long. Little Treasure sat there quietly sculpting away. With every stroke of his knife, another sliver of wood would fall, just like the rain outside. More and more cultivators were mobilized. They began to set up spell formations and hew out canals. However, all that did was alleviate a bit of the pressure, not solve the problem. It was in this fashion that 3 years passed. During that time, the rain never stopped. People began to move to other locations on the continent as one village after another was swallowed up by water. Plains vanished, and eventually, even the city Little Treasure lived in sank beneath the waters. Little Treasure and his family left with the other refugees, heading to higher ground. Along the way, Little Treasure's parents fell ill. They were old and had grown frail, and nearly lost their lives to the illness. However, just when it seemed hopeless, they made a sudden recovery. Little Treasure was delighted, although he couldn't see how ashen his wife's face was in that moment. The rain fell harder. People died on a daily basis. Among all of the refugees who were traveling to higher ground, only Little Treasure and his family kept their spirits up. Furthermore, Little Treasure never stopped sculpting. Every day he would spend time working on his statue. The exodus took a full year. Eventually, they reached a tall mountain which gradually came to be packed with more and more refugees. Suddenly, the rain stopped. Everyone began to cry out in joy, only to feel a frigid wind blow across their faces, a wind which seemed to drain them of all warmth. In that instant, their spirits turned as cold as ice. The rain had stopped, but the snow had just begun. The temperature on the first continent dropped rapidly. Snow began to fall, and Little Treasure shivered. He felt the snow landing on his face, and he could hear everyone around him crying out in alarm. It was a depressing sound, a sound filled with death and despair. Before, everything had been wet, but now, everything was freezing cold. This sudden change in the weather took the disaster to a new, unprecedented level. Snow filled the lands and the temperature plummeted. The ground froze over, and vile coldness reached its claws everywhere. Not even the canals could escape and were frozen solid. More cultivators attempted to interfere with the heavens, but any who did would eventually drop dead with no warning. There was even an 8 essences paragon who, in the midst of attempting to stop the disaster, was suddenly blasted by a wind so cold it froze his soul, and he died instantly. After that, no one dared to do anything. Because of the rain and then the snow, the first sect was uprooted and forced to move. According to their understanding, the heavens had sent this disaster to destroy the first continent. There was nothing that could be done. There was no resisting it. Even the sect leader could do nothing but shake his head bitterly. Furthermore, he had the feeling that the disaster was far from over. The first sect evacuated. On that night, Little Treasure's wife Yanner was looking up at the falling snow. She knew that the first sect was leaving, and finally decided that it was time to take Little Treasure and their daughter away from the first continent. However, just when she was about to unleash some magic, the energy of heaven and earth that existed in the first continent vanished. Just like that, all of the spiritual energy, all of the energy of the vast expanse, was suddenly gone as if it had been cut off. Not a single trace was left behind. Something shocking resulted because of the disappearance of the energy of heaven and earth. In that instant, all of the cultivators on the first continent gaped in shock. It was as if a huge pressure had suddenly descended onto them. All of their years of cultivation, all of their cultivation base power was gone, no matter how they fought or struggled to keep it. As of this moment, all of them fell back down into the mortal realm. They were now mortals. It was as if a huge blanket had been tossed over the lands of the first continent, making it impossible for anyone to leave, and also ensuring that no one dared to enter. Any cultivator who crossed the border into the first continent would instantly become a mortal. The entire vast expanse school was stirred into action. All of the 9 essences paragons gathered at the borders of the first continent, which they stared at in shock. All of them were trembling deep in their hearts. The wrath of the heavens, the sect leader murmured inwardly. He looked up into the heavens, into the starry sky of all heaven, and based on the level of his cultivation base, he could tell that, for some reason, the entire starry sky seemed enraged at the first continent. At the same time, numerous cultivators who were proficient in prophesying and performing auguries began to call upon their skill to investigate. One after another, they were hit with backlashes that left them coughing up blood. And yet, they all came to the same conclusion. Punishment from the heavens. The heavens are enraged. Something happened which infuriated the vast expanse, right here on the first continent. There is a power building up on the first continent, a power that the starry sky of the vast expanse views as an enemy. We have to separate ourselves from that power. We have to seal this place off. Otherwise, the power might spread out from the first land mass and affect all of the starry sky. Such predictions and explanations only grew more numerous. Eventually, the first continent was completely sealed off. All of the cultivators there who had lost their cultivation bases could do nothing but shiver as they looked in despair at the falling snow. Yanner was among them. She smiled bitterly, and yet knew that there was nothing she could do to change the situation. Little Treasure wasn't aware of how his wife had changed. However, he could feel death approaching. He knew the world had changed. It was unfamiliar now and filled with rage and murder. More people died. Violent chaos filled the lands. In the midst of a disaster like this, the worst side of people was what showed. That was how people survived. The entire continent began to degenerate. As the snow fell and the temperature dropped, more people turned into corpses. The survivors could do nothing more than search for places to try to survive the cold. Some survivors formed groups, which huddled together in caves in the mountains as they fought to live. Food grew scarce, making it even more difficult to keep going. In order to get even a bit of food, many young women did things they would never have done before. People fought and killed others, and stories of cannibalism began to circulate. Pretty women often had it the worst, so Little Treasure's wife, having lost her cultivation base, used a knife to disfigure her own face. On that night, Little Treasure wrapped his arms around his wife and daughter, and they all wept together. Chapter 15:22. Oh, how cruel. In that moment, Meng Hao was floating in the air far up above. He was the only person on the first continent who didn't seem to have been affected by the sudden disappearance of the energy of heaven and earth. He looked down at the 9th incarnation of his clone, a complex expression twisting his face. He looked down at Yanner with her disfigured face and perfect. He looked at the family down below, and after a long moment passed, he sighed. At the moment, he still felt that the best thing to do was refrain from interfering. A few months passed. Little Treasure, despite being blind, was very skilled in carpentry, which was a valuable skill in the frigid world in which they lived. Because of that, he was one of the few people among the refugees who was permitted to live inside the cave on the mountain where they resided. There was little to eat, so Little Treasure slowly began to lose weight. It was the same with his wife. She was no longer beautiful like she had been, and her hair was plastered onto her like a wilted flower. The truth was that in these deadly and critical times, Yanner had the option of living a much better life if she wanted. Despite having lost her cultivation base, her body still retained its regenerative powers, and as such, despite having disfigured herself, she soon recovered and was beautiful just like before. A beautiful person like that could easily find ways to have a nice life, despite the disastrous state of the world. Instead, she chose to disfigure herself again and continued to do so each time she recovered. She would rather stay with Little Treasure and her daughter. They were her family. It was just like the year when she had first laid eyes on Little Treasure and realized that he was the reincarnation of the master she had been searching for. Just as she had then, she murmured, "I'm here to protect you." Time passed and things only got worse. It was so cold that people who stayed outside of the caves for too long would often freeze to death. Eventually, Little Treasure stopped doing any woodworking at all. He focused only on sculpting the ninth ceiling mark. That was his focus, his obsession, his purpose in life. He never stopped. He had already had a relatively low position among the refugees in the cave. Eventually, the most vicious people among the refugees decided that a carpenter wasn't very useful, and Little Treasure's situation got worse. Despite her scarred face, Yanner had a very attractive body, which made things even more difficult considering that they were surrounded by bored and tormented individuals who were losing touch with their humanity. Worst of all, their daughter was now 16 years old. One night, Perfect went missing. On that day, Little Treasure trembled. He felt as if his world had collapsed. His wife was also left trembling. The two of them left the cave to search for their daughter. "Perfect, Perfect, where are you?" they called out miserably as they searched. Little Treasure couldn't help but think back to the time he had been alone in the woods and had wept in fear and anxiety. He was scared now too, but he forced his thoughts under control and reminded himself that he was searching for his daughter. Eventually, he and Yanner split up. He kept his hands on a wall which he followed along, simultaneously calling out for his daughter. Eventually, he could tell that the sun was rising, and yet he hadn't found a single clue. No one helped them search. The others in the cave simply looked at them coldly. "Perfect, my Perfect." A bitter smile twisted Little Treasure's lips as he continued to search for his daughter. Yet even his wife couldn't find her, let alone him, a blind man. He couldn't see the world and as of this moment felt more useless than ever, completely useless. Then he heard a miserable cry, a cry filled with despair. It was a cry that seemed to come from the lips of someone who wished to end their own life. It was Perfect's voice, but rather his wife's. A tremor ran through Little Treasure. Although his eyes were sightless, they were still bloodshot. He immediately began to walk toward the sound, which wasn't too far away from where he stood. He began to run. He fell. He hit his head on rocks. He was soon bleeding all over, but he continued to run. When he reached the voice, he heard a sinister laugh. "Damned slut, you're pretty ugly, but I've taken a liking to you, hear me? It's your lucky day. Give me what I want and I'll give your family a kilo of meat. What do you say?" Up ahead, Yanner was holding a dagger up to her own throat. She had been backed up against a cliff face by three burly men. If she had her cultivation base, she could kill them with a mere glance. But now, she was nothing more than a frail mortal woman. Tears welled up in her eyes as the men inched closer. She bit her lip and was just on the verge of killing herself when she saw Little Treasure lurching her way, covered in blood. She wasn't the only one who noticed. The three burly men turned and started laughing. "The blind man's here. Great. You two grab him. All right, listen up, bitch. Be a good girl for daddy, otherwise I'll boil your husband in front of your own eyes and then eat him." Yanner looked over at Little Treasure, and the dagger she held trembled. As two of the men walked forward to grab Little Treasure, the other one grinned viciously and closed in on Yanner. It was at this point that Little Treasure suddenly smiled. It was a very vicious-looking smile, considering that his face was spattered in blood. He suddenly rose to his feet, seemingly bursting with strength. It was as if all the potential strength of his life force had erupted. His teeth ripped into the neck of one of the men, who had been completely unprepared to be so viciously attacked by a weak blind person. He screamed, clamping his hands down onto the wound. Off to the side, the second man gasped. Little Treasure's ear twitched, and then he pounced onto the screaming man, madly ripping one chunk of flesh after another out of him. The burly man who had been advancing on Yanner let out a bellow of rage and was about to leap into the fray when Yanner lunged and began to stab her dagger into his back over and over again. The remaining man instantly fled. his face filled with terror. The maddened Little Treasure had ripped so many bloody chunks out of the man's skin that he was now dead. Little Treasure stumbled forward until he found his wife, whom he wrapped up in his arms. Together, they wept. They never found their daughter. When they returned to the cave, the other refugees looked at them with fear. In a world which seemed to have reached the end of days, people only feared ferocity and repulsiveness. The more repulsive, the more terrified they would be. Later, people told them that during the previous night, a group of young men had kidnapped Perfect and taken her away. Originally, it had been assumed that Perfect would never be seen again, whereas the young men would. However, after day broke, even the young men didn't return. As for what exactly had occurred, people had their suspicions, but no one knew for sure. Of course, nobody in the caves knew that at the bottom of the mountain, in another set of caves, a group of 4 corpses was already growing cold. They were 4 young men, whose faces were plastered with expressions of terror and disbelief. At first, Meng Hao had decided not to interfere with the life of his clone's 9th reincarnation, not even when it came to his relationship with Yanner. But as time went on, and the 9th reincarnation's life changed, Meng Hao started to waver. Then Perfect was kidnapped by the 4 young men, and Meng Hao simply couldn't stand idly by. After all, the daughter of the 9th reincarnation was also his own flesh and blood. He took Perfect away to the 9th continent. Meng Hao was the 9th paragon, leader of the 9th sect, and with that status, all he had to do was tell the other paragons of the 9th sect that she was his daughter. That ensured that Perfect would have a respectable status for the rest of her life. As for the 9th reincarnation, the purpose of his life was to complete the 9th hex, and Yanner was an adult who could make her own decisions. She had her own karma. But Perfect was innocent, and didn't deserve to be subject to such bitterness on the 1st continent. Meng Hao looked warmly at Perfect, then turned and left the 9th sect. He returned to the 1st continent and the caves. There, the day was growing brighter. From that moment on, things changed for Little Treasure and Yanner. They had shown their vicious side, especially Little Treasure, who despite being blind, had ripped a man to death with his teeth. When people saw the corpses of the men they had killed, they gasped. The small group which had previously bullied Little Treasure was left completely shaken and afraid. In the days to follow, Little Treasure and Yanner eventually learned of the 4 corpses in the other cave. Other people confirmed that those were the 4 young men who had kidnapped Perfect. They had been dead for some time, and yet there was no trace of Perfect. It was as if she had simply vanished. Although it was a bitter end to the matter, at least Little Treasure had hope. For some reason, he was convinced that Perfect wasn't dead, and was in fact more blessed than she had ever been. Because Little Treasure was blind, he couldn't see the look on his wife's face as they stood above the corpses of the 4 young men. At first she looked confused, and then, somewhat dazed. She wasn't sure who had rescued Perfect, but was convinced that whoever it was had been a very powerful person. Despite the fact that the current state of heaven and earth made it impossible to unleash one's cultivation base, that person must somehow have been able to leave the 1st continent. In that case, it meant that Perfect was most likely safe. However, the entire matter was still a heavy blow to Little Treasure. He was struck with a deadly illness which rapidly deteriorated his body. When the end of days struck the world, falling ill was like a sentence of death. Yanner worked herself to the bone to take care of him. A year later, he actually recovered, but by that time, Yanner was like skin and bones. The truth was that, without his wife, Little Treasure would definitely have died. He had never been inclined to words, but after his illness, he spoke even less. Most of the time, he focused on sculpting. He had been working on the sculpture for decades now, to the point where it was as smooth as glass and as dark as night. Chapter 1523, My Destiny. He continued to sculpt, one knife stroke at a time. The statue was gradually taking shape. Another decade passed. It was now 90% complete, and the world outside was colder than ever. The wind blew, and food grew even more scarce. Even the caves got colder and colder. It was not uncommon for people to fall asleep and never wake up. Things got worse until the caves were little warmer than the outside. Things began to freeze over, and soon, there was so much ice that the people left had only one choice: stay and die, or leave the caves and try to find some other place to live. The first group of people who left never returned. Then a second group left, and a third. One morning, Little Treasure woke up to a very strange feeling. He reached out to touch his wife and realized that she was very stiff. He began to massage her, eventually holding her in his arms until she finally awoke. He knew why she was like this. At night, she would lay next to him in such a way that the wind didn't blow on him. After a moment of silence, Little Treasure said, "Let's leave this place." A few days later, the fourth group of people marched out into the wind and snow. The world was completely white as they searched for another location to hunker down in. 3 days later, an avalanche suddenly struck, burying the entire group. Meng Hao hovered in midair up above, looking down. By this point, he had suppressed the impulse to intervene on too many occasions to count. But now, he really felt as if he had no choice. He was just about to do something when his jaw dropped. Down in the snow, one area began to shake, and then a woman crawled out. It was Yanner. She was a cultivator, so despite having lost the use of her cultivation base, her body was a lot tougher than a mortal's. Despite her weakened state, she was able to drag a person with her out of the snow, which was the unconscious Little Treasure. Within the world of ice and snow, everything was quiet. Yanner wrapped her arms around Little Treasure to warm him up, then slung him over her shoulder. Looking around blankly for a moment, she then began to trudge onward. Meng Hao felt deeply and profoundly shaken. Yanner was very weak by this point, but she used what energy she had to press on with determination. She walked for 3 days, during which time Little Treasure lapsed in and out of consciousness. His skin was very hot, although not from fever but rather because he was on the verge of freezing to death. Tears leaked out of Yanner's eyes. She called out to him and held him close to keep him warm. Little Treasure's aura was growing weaker and weaker. By this point, Meng Hao could even see his soul was on the verge of emerging. That told him that his clone's 9th reincarnation was reaching the end of his life. Eyes glittering, he extended his finger toward the clone. But then he suddenly stopped, and his hand quivered. There was something pushing back against him, making it impossible for him to interfere. Furthermore, Meng Hao could sense that the 8 complete sealing marks had suddenly cracked. Apparently, if he did anything more to interfere, they would be destroyed, and the 9th sealing mark would also completely vanish. Meng Hao sank into his silence. Although this was his first time attempting to take control of the 9th sealing mark, he had long since anticipated that something like this might happen. Is it all a failure? He thought, gazing blankly at Little Treasure's soul as it struggled to emerge and fly away. However, it was at this point that Yanner did something that completely shocked Meng Hao. She looked at Little Treasure's ashen face and at his chest, which was barely rising and falling. A tender expression appeared in her eyes. "Master, I love you," she murmured. "I loved you in my last life, and it's the same in this one." She lifted her wrist up to her mouth and bit down hard. Then she lowered it down to Little Treasure's mouth, allowing the blood to flow into him. Her own blood was the warmest part of her. The wound closed up a moment later, so she ripped open another gash. The pain meant nothing to her. As long as the hot, nourishing blood could help Little Treasure to recover, she was willing to do it. Little Treasure's destiny hadn't been fulfilled, nor was he dead. So she picked him up and struggled back to the caves where they had lived for so many years. After they arrived, she collapsed into unconsciousness. A few days later, Little Treasure woke up. He couldn't see his wife, but he knew that she had saved his life yet again. In his bitterness, Little Treasure began to weep. Eventually, Yanner wrapped her arms around him, and the two of them sat there in the coldness of the cave, feeling each other's warmth. After some time passed, Little Treasure suddenly reached up and began to pat his clothing. When he didn't find what he was looking for, he began to tremble. The wooden statue was gone. It was more than 90% complete and had been with him for years upon years. But now, it was buried somewhere in the snow. A moment passed. Little Treasure felt as if he had lost his soul. He sighed bitterly. When his wife realized what had happened, she didn't say anything. However, later that night, after Little Treasure had fallen asleep, she rose to her feet, straightened her clothes, and then walked to the mouth of the cave. After turning to look back at Little Treasure for a moment, she gritted her teeth and walked out into the snow. She knew what her husband's destiny was. She followed the same path they had taken when they left. Because of the blood loss, she was now very weak, like a flame that could be snuffed out at any moment by the freezing wind. After walking for a few days, she reached the place where the avalanche had struck. Then she began to dig. She dug and dug until her hands were stiff. She dug up one corpse after another, corpses belonging to the group they had been traveling with. Her vision was swimming by the time she found the little wooden statue. She smiled, put the statue into her garment, and then, fighting the urge to pass out, turned and walked back. A day later, she was getting hot but was in much better spirits. She began to walk faster and continued to get hotter. 2 days later, she reached the cave and smiled. She wasn't even sure how she had returned. She entered, and as soon as she saw Little Treasure, she stumbled and fell into his arms. "Little Treasure," she said softly, "I managed to get your statue back. I should stay to protect you, but I don't think I can. Master, I love you." Little Treasure trembled as Yanner's aura faded away. Backslash. A few days earlier, Little Treasure had awoken to find his wife gone. He wasn't sure where she had left to, and considering he was blind, it wasn't really possible to track her down. He could only sit there in the cave, shivering, paying close attention to the sounds he heard. However, all he heard was the whistling of the wind and not his wife's footsteps. He waited a whole day, then another and another. Soon he began to lose hope. Eventually he began to chuckle bitterly and recall that time in the forest when he was a child. Why did I have to be born blind? He had always deceived himself into believing that it didn't matter that he couldn't see the world. But as of this moment, he hated the fact that he was blind. Everyone's gone. Dad and Mom are gone. Perfect is gone, and now you're gone. I'm the only one left. Tears flowed down his face. His hair had long since turned gray. There he sat, an old man in a cave, crying alone. He wasn't sure how much time passed. First it was hours, then days. Eventually he heard footsteps in the wind, very familiar footsteps. He began to tremble as he rose to his feet, and suddenly she fell into his arms. She was cold, freezing cold. "Little Treasure," she said softly, "I managed to get your statue back. I should stay to protect you, but I don't think I can. Master, I love you." Those 3 sentences struck Little Treasure like lightning. Trembling, he held her body, unsure of what to say. His throat seemed stuck shut, unable of emitting sound. His heart felt as if it had just been stabbed through. He suddenly coughed up some blood, which splattered onto his wife's body like crimson flower petals. He thought back to the young woman he had met in the forest as a boy. He thought about the night they were married. He thought about how he had lifted her veil and touched her face. He thought about the day Perfect was born and how everyone had been so happy. He thought about how, when it started to rain, his wife stuck with him the entire time, even when he was sculpting. He thought about how sad he had been when his parents died and how she had comforted him. He thought about how she had cared for him when he was sick and how she blocked the wind with her own body. Finally, he thought about how she had nourished him with her own blood after the avalanche. That taste still seemed to linger in his mouth. He held her in his arms for a long, long time. Eventually, her aura was gone, and yet Little Treasure didn't want to believe it. More tears flowed. It's fine," he murmured. "I'm here. You rest for a bit. You're so cold, let me try to warm you up." Little Treasure carried his wife's corpse deep into the cave, where he tried to warm her with his own body. Chapter 15:24. 9 Reincarnations Together. Unfortunately, no matter how he tried to warm her, he couldn't prevent her from becoming colder and colder. His anxiety grew, and his mind began to race. Eventually, he bit at his wrist and tried to pour his blood into her mouth. He smiled. "It's fine, everything's going to be fine," he murmured. Eventually, he passed out. He was now alone in the cave. Everyone else had left. The only ones who stayed behind were the corpses. After some time passed, he woke up again. He reached out to touch his wife, and she was as cold as ice. Little Treasure went mad. He ripped open his other wrist with his teeth to pour more blood into her mouth, but her mouth had frozen shut. "Drink it," he murmured. "Drink my blood and you'll be fine. It's warm. Don't get any colder, please." Tears streamed down his face as he babbled on. Eventually, he wrapped his arms around her corpse and wept. The sound of his wailing echoed out in the cave, until the wind rose up and drowned it out. He was soon overwhelmed with a feeling of complete and utter loneliness. But then, strangely, he wasn't afraid anymore. He stroked his wife's face, feeling how cold it was, and softly said, "You know, back when we got married, I knew something that my dad and Mom never knew. You're not a mortal. You're an immortal." His eyes had no pupils, and yet they seemed to radiate warmth. "How could I not know that the person who saved me in the forest was you?" He continued to stroke her face, wiping away the frost that was forming. From his expression, it was clear that he was thinking about the past. "Back then," he murmured, "I knew that you had to be one of those legendary immortals, and yet I couldn't figure out why you would choose me. Sometimes when you were looking at me, though, I could sense that the person you saw wasn't me. The person you truly loved wasn't me, was it? It was your master. I'm blind, unable to see the world that the rest of you live in, but the world that exists in my heart is a world that none of you can see, and there is something about that world that no one could possibly know." Little Treasure smiled as he talked to his wife. "I'll tell you, okay? I've never told anyone before, not even my parents. I've seen people before in my world. They lived on different continents and they lived different lives than mine. One was very happy, one was a businessman, one was a hunter. One of them wielded incredible power. Another was a coroner, and there was even an assassin. There was another person, an immortal, and he had an apprentice named Yanner. She looked a lot like you. He smiled faintly. Do you know why I've been working on this little sculpture? It's because all of those other people, all of them have been insisting that I have to finish sculpting it. I have to finish making this wooden statue. I have to force the heavens open their eyes or to close their eyes. Having the power to force them to close their eyes isn't enough. What those other people want is the power of absolute control over the eyes of the heavens, to force them to open their eyes. If I want the heavens to close their eyes, they will have no choice but to comply. Little Treasure chuckled. Stroking his wife's freezing face one more, he turned his head and said, "Am I right?" Although Little Treasure was blind when he spoke those words, he was looking directly at a person who was standing right behind him. It was none other than Meng Hao. Meng Hao looked down at Little Treasure, his eyes shining with bright, piercing light. As of this moment, his heart was pounding. The development he had most feared had occurred. Something had occurred which made it so that Meng Hao was incapable of controlling the ninth reincarnation of his clone. Perhaps there was something unique about the ninth reincarnation's body, or perhaps it was a result of using the incomplete 8 sealing marks of the ninth hex when he was outside the vast expanse. For whatever reason, Meng Hao had been very reluctant to interfere. Eventually, when he finally gave in and tried to do something, he met with resistance, and now he found that something completely unexpected had occurred. The ninth reincarnation was him, but obviously had developed an independent mind. He was different from the previous reincarnations. He could not be controlled. Although Little Treasure couldn't see the world around him, he somehow seemed to be looking directly at Meng Hao as he said, "I could sense a thread connecting me to all 8 of those people who appeared in my world. And that thread connected to someone else too. That person is you. My guess is that I am your clone. Yanner's master was also your clone. Am I right?" After a moment of silence, Meng Hao said, "Yes, both you and the other reincarnations you saw were created for a single purpose, to complete my ninth hex." Little Treasure nodded thoughtfully. "So that's how it is, and what about her? Was she really your apprentice?" Meng Hao looked down at Yanner. "Without her, this ninth reincarnation would have long since died. She was the apprentice of my clone. In her previous life, I came to owe her a huge debt." By this point, Little Treasure looked very, very old. "What about my daughter? Well, I guess she's your daughter too, right?" "She's safe," Meng Hao replied softly, "in the ninth sect on the ninth continent. I guess we've reached the end of it all. I have no last words to say, I suppose." Little Treasure sat there quietly. After enough time had passed for an incense stick to burn, he reached down and pulled the wooden statue out from his wife's garment. He rubbed the wood and sighed. "I really hate the idea of other people controlling my destiny. Even when that person is my true self, I still hate it. You know, I could sever the thread that connects the two of us at any time." Little Treasure picked up his sculpting knife, and in that moment, he somehow seemed to possess the power to sever karma. If he did, then it wouldn't matter if the ninth hex were completed. Meng Hao would not be able to even touch it. Meng Hao stood there silently. Little Treasure looked over at his wife, grief playing across his face. After a long moment, his knife moved. He didn't sever the thread, but instead began to sculpt the wood. He cut with incredible speed, as if he were pouring all the power of his life into his work. Gradually, the 8th reincarnation appeared behind him, then the 7th, the 6th, the 5th, all the way to the 1st. 9 reincarnations were all contained in one body. Together, they controlled the knife, causing the final sealing mark of the ninth hex to gradually take shape. Outside, thunder boomed. It seemed enraged, and its roars filled the world. Wind screamed and snow battered the lands. It was in that moment that Little Treasure's knife stopped moving. The wooden statue was 99% complete. It only required one more knife stroke. "It's difficult to perfect something I've never touched," he murmured. Instantly, his soul, as well as the images of the other 8 reincarnations, suddenly flew out of the cave. As the will of all heaven roared up above, they shot high into the sky, touching the heavens, feeling the will of all heaven. For the first time ever, the will of all heaven trembled. For the first time, it felt fear. For the first time, it retreated. That was Little Treasure's aura, in the form of the 8 incarnations. It was also a heaven-sealing aura. That aura was the result of the 9 perfected sealing marks. After combining, they formed the true seal the heavens hex. As soon as it appeared, it spread out to fill heaven and earth. In the starry sky of all heaven, the will of all heaven which existed everywhere was now shaking, and the fear it felt continued to mount. Thunder boomed, and the clouds churned. It appeared as if the will of all heaven were truly being forced to flee. It was pushed out of the first continent, pushed out of the lands. The seal the heavens hex might have seemed weak initially, but it actually existed on a completely different level than the other hexes. In fact, it existed on a higher level than the will of all heaven. It was a power that caused even that will to be completely shocked. This was Meng Hao's 9th hex, the seal the heavens hex. I felt it, Little Treasure said, smiling. He opened his eyes. All of the other reincarnations also smiled. Then they merged together, transforming into a beam of light that shot back down to the lands below, back into the cave, to Little Treasure's body. Then he lifted his knife to make the final cut on the wooden statue. Boom! The knife cut the wood, and the statue was complete. The 9 sealing marks of the 9th hex, the seal the heavens hex, were, as of this moment, complete. The entire starry sky of all heaven began to shake and tremble. A tempest sprang up with planet vast expanse at the center. It spread out, wider and wider, covering everything. In that moment, the barrier which had surrounded the first continent began to fragment and crack. A moment later, it exploded, sending a huge shockwave out in all directions. All of the snow on the first continent melted instantly, transforming into a mist that rose up into the air. The mist was then caught by the wind and vanished. The lands were restored, the plains appeared again, mountains stood tall, cities reappeared, even the first sect could be seen again. At the same time, an indescribable power filled the lands, causing grass to sprout on the plains. The withered trees in the forests suddenly began to grow again, and all of the mountains became lush with vegetation. Expand. Everything in the past which had died, regardless of whether they had frozen to death or drowned, regardless of whether they were cultivators or mortals, regardless of whether they were animals or plants, were all resurrected. Even if the corpses had vanished, they returned to life from nothing. The shattered buildings and collapsed mountains were restored in the blink of an eye. All of the lands were like they were before. According to the ancient saying, when one man achieves the Tao, all those beneath him will also ascend. That was exactly what was happening with the seal the heavens hex. From within death, life appeared. Rumbling sounds filled the first continent as everything was restored. As that happened, planet vast expanse was shaken, as were all of the lands that filled the starry sky of all heaven. All worlds, all realms, all the dust, everything was vibrating. All cultivators, all species, all forms of life, everything that existed trembled in shock and astonishment. Jin Yunqian gasped, and Sha Jiudong was left shivering. Bai Wuchen's eyes went wide with amazement. The sect leader's jaw dropped, and all of the other 9 essences cultivators were battered by waves of shock. Each of them felt compelled to drop to their knees and kowtow to the first continent. It was almost as if something were being born there. That surpassed the vast expanse itself. In the first location where Meng Hao had acquired a copper mirror shard, the enormous basilisk lizard with the peak 9 essences battle prowess was currently sleeping. Suddenly, it trembled and looked up, astonishment shining in its eyes. In the ice-fire realm, the Ice Mountain Giant and the Flame Phoenix could feel the fluctuations rolling out through the starry sky of all heaven, and were suddenly struck with fear. On the flourishing immortal god continent was a certain sect that held the most prominent position among all of the other sects. It was a powerful sect, and within that sect was a disciple by the name of Tao Heaven, a new chosen within the sect. He was currently sitting there cross-legged in meditation. For years, his heart had been filled with various questions and speculations, and yet he had never been able to prove whether or not they were right. In fact, the ideas in his head seemed almost too fantastic to believe. However, as of this moment, the entire immortal god continent suddenly trembled. Every entity in those lands stopped what they were doing and looked up. Mortals, cultivators, and even the animals all suddenly seemed to lack the energy to even move. The entire world went completely still and quiet. Except for Tao Heaven, he could move. A tremor ran through him as he suddenly sensed a familiar aura. A smile broke out on his face and tears began to stream down his cheeks. Finally, he threw his head back and laughed uproariously. Tao Heaven, of course, was the former echelon cultivator of the first mountain and sea. A similar scene played out on the Devil Realm continent. It was the same in the 33 heavens above the mountain and sea butterfly. Outside the 33 heavens, sitting there on guard, was the monkey Dao Fang, whose heart suddenly trembled. In all of the starry sky of all heaven, things were shaking, and rumbling like thunder could be heard. At the same time, the will of all heaven seemed to cause everything to shake with its rage. It roared in fury as well as terror. It was terrified because it could sense that a new aura had appeared within the starry sky. It was a new power, a Tao, that superseded the heavenly Tao. That Tao could be called the Seal the Heavens Tao. The Seal the Heavens Tao was boundlessly domineering. It refused to allow anyone to offend it. It refused to allow any other will to change it. It could make the heavens open their eyes and could make the heavens close their eyes. If I want the heavens' eyes closed, they won't dare to refuse. What I want the heavens shall not lack. What I don't want had better not exist in the heavens. Back on planet Vast Expanse on the first continent, everyone was resurrected. However, Yanner remained frozen. After making the final knife cut, Little Treasure flicked his sleeve, and the statue and knife flew over toward Meng Hao. As of this moment, his eyes were different. Before, they had no pupils, but now they did. He looked around at the world and saw light. Of course, he didn't care about the world. He slowly looked down at his wife and smiled. This was the first time he had ever seen her appearance. She was ugly, her face covered with scars and wounds. But to Little Treasure, she was the most beautiful thing in existence. He knelt down and wrapped his arms around her, smiling contentedly. Eventually, he closed his eyes and his aura vanished. His soul flew out. It, along with the souls of all the other reincarnations, became a beam of light that shot toward the statue in Meng Hao's hand. The light entered the statue, which then glowed brightly. It was now truly complete. That wooden statue was Meng Hao's 9th hex. Once he absorbed it, he could combine the 9 hexes. And yet he felt no joy. It was hard to pinpoint exactly what emotions he felt as he looked down at Little Treasure's corpse, which was gradually transforming into motes of light that floated through the air and merged into Meng Hao. After all, he had been part of Meng Hao to begin with. Meng Hao knew that Little Treasure could have refused to cooperate. Meng Hao was the true self, and he was the clone, a part that had essentially been cut out from Meng Hao. He didn't like being controlled, didn't like others being in charge of his destiny. And yet, in the end, he chose to complete the 9th hex and to help Meng Hao. Of course, Meng Hao knew that he did it not for him, but for Yanner. This 9th reincarnation of his clone loved Yanner much more than Meng Hao's true self did. Meng Hao stood there in the cave for a long, long time. Eventually, the motes of light that were Little Treasure merged fully into Meng Hao. All traces of the clone's existence had been wiped out, except for the sculpting knife and the wooden statue. Meng Hao sighed. Yanner's body was also transforming into motes of light that gradually began to fade away. Her soul hovered there, complete and whole, just in front of Meng Hao. She was looking at her fading corpse and the empty spot next to it, where another person had been laying moments ago. Some time passed, after which she turned and looked at Meng Hao. "Should I call you the 9th paragon?" she asked softly, "or master or Little Treasure?" Meng Hao extended his right hand, within which were 2 soul strands. One was the strand which had been fused with Han Bei. The other contained memories of a previous life. The 2 soul strands merged together into one, becoming a beautiful stream of light that flowed over to Yanner. "That is a part of your soul," Meng Hao said quietly. "If you absorb it, your soul will be complete and you'll remember everything from the past. You will remember who exactly I am." Yanner looked quietly at the beautiful light, a calm smile slowly growing on her face. "What happened to Perfect?" "She's in the 9th sect." Yanner nodded and looked off into the distance. Some more time passed before she spoke again. "This 9th reincarnation was enough for me. What need is there of past memories? Now that I think about it, I'm sure that there are many regrets within those memories. All I know is that you are my master and that I lived a good life." She closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, they were bright and clear. She waved her finger at the soul light, the light which contained the memories of her past life. The light faded away. With that, she clasped hands and bowed to Meng Hao. "This life is over. Master, I won't interfere in your world anymore. Thank you for caring for me throughout the years." She looked at Meng Hao one last time, then turned away. In front of her, a reincarnation vortex appeared. Just as she was about to step in, she stopped in place. "You promised to tell me the rest of the story of Chu Yuyan, but I already know what happens." She smiled and took a deep breath. She had long since come to the conclusion that she herself was the second half of Chu Yuyan's story. Apparently, she had finally chosen to free herself from all burdens. What she had just said was no lie. She was content. Looking free and at ease, she waved at Meng Hao and then stepped into reincarnation. To her, spending an eternity with the one she loved wasn't necessary. She was happy with one lifetime. Meng Hao stood quietly in the cave, eyes somewhat blank. The ninth hex was complete, but he didn't feel happy at all. In fact, melancholy gripped at his heart. After some time passed, he shook his head and buried his feelings deep inside. He walked out of the cave and felt the soft breeze on his face. It lifted his hair and rustled his garments, almost as if it were taking away the bad memories with it. A look of determination appeared on his face, and his eyes began to shine. His cultivation over the past 1,000 years and all of the things he had experienced had forged him into something even harder than before. His face looked young, but if you looked closely, there was something about him that could only be seen on someone who had existed for many years and seen many things. There were even some faint wrinkles visible around the corners of his eyes. He did nothing to conceal the changes. It's time to go back, he thought, looking up at the blue sky and the white clouds. Off in the distance was a red beam of light flying toward him. It was the mastiff, who landed in front of him and looked up quietly. He stroked the mastiff's fur, and the light in his eyes grew more incisive than ever. After I absorb the ninth hex and ensure that it's complete, I can combine the 9 hexes and extinguish the bronze lamp. Then I will transcend. And after that, we can go home. Although he didn't speak very loudly, it was as if his voice merged with heaven and earth and spread out through the starry sky. Back in the world of the mountain and sea butterfly, a faint voice could suddenly be heard. I'm coming back. Chapter 1525, Goodbye Yen. Chapter 1526, A Place to Transcend. As his voice echoed out, countless people were left shaken. Su Qing was sitting cross-legged in meditation. Her eyes slowly opened, and tears of joy rolled down her face. Everyone had been waiting for hundreds of years, and at long last, the demon sovereign was going to return. In the world of the mountain and sea butterfly, Fatty, who was now the lord of an important sect, was in the middle of reprimanding some people, when suddenly a tremor ran through him. He then began to laugh until tears streamed down his face, to the bafflement of everyone else. Somewhere deep within the world of the mountain and sea butterfly was an area of extreme coldness. There, a middle-aged cultivator was sitting cross-legged, surrounded by freezing air. He looked very sinister, and his eyes were closed, although that was because he was blind. Suddenly a tremor ran through him, and his eyelids opened to reveal black pits. As he opened his eyes, a tempest sprang up around him, and a smile broke out on his face. In another location in the mountain and sea butterfly world was Li Linger, who continued to carry out Paragon Sea Dream's final wishes. After accepting Sea Dream's legacy, she had founded the Sea Dream Association, which had grown large over the past several hundred years. As she sat cross-legged in the sect's secluded meditation facilities, she suddenly shivered and her eyes opened. She looked up into the sky and smiled. Despite the fact that her hair was white with age, her smile was just as beautiful as always. In another area was a house on top of a mountain, where Meng Hao's sister lived with Sun Hai. They had long since married and had a son and a daughter. Their children were grown and had borne grandchildren, making them their own little clan. Little brother is coming back, Fang Yu said, her eyes shining with reminiscence. Everywhere in the mountain and sea butterfly, people were shaken, including one woman by the name of Xianxia, who was smiling with anticipation. There was another young man who happened to be seated cross-legged on the back of a huge whale, which was flying through the air. The young man was leaning up against a coffin, and he held an alcohol flagon in his hand, from which he sipped. A smile broke out on his face. He's coming back, Knight, said the young man. He was Qi Jiusi, and the whale was True Spirit Knight. There was a sect in the world of the mountain and sea butterfly called the Kunlun Society. Back when the mountain and sea realm was destroyed, the Kunlun Society had been preserved. They even managed to save many of their most important objects from within the sect, which they took with them into the mountain and sea butterfly. One of those objects was a coffin made from immortal jade and filled with Meng Hao's divine sense. The highest mountain in the Kunlun Society didn't have a sharp, jagged peak. Instead, it had a hollow depression at the top. Within that basin were countless spell formations, as well as piles of immortal jade. In the middle of it was that very coffin. Inside the coffin was a very beautiful woman. Her eyes were closed as if she were sleeping. It was none other than Chu Yuyan's true self. Because of the power of Meng Hao's divine sense and the protective measures set up by the Kunlun Society, she had been preserved down to this day. even as everyone in the mountain and sea butterfly who was familiar with Meng Hao sensed that he was coming. A white-haired old man was standing next to that coffin, looking at the woman inside. He was Pill Demon, Meng Hao's master, and also master to Chu Yuyan. Pill Demon gazed at Chu Yuyan for a while, then sighed. He was just about to turn and leave when a tremor ran through him. He looked back at Chu Yuyan and for some reason was convinced that he had seen her eyelashes flutter. Pill Demon gasped, "This." He looked closer, and although Chu Yuyan clearly wasn't awake, he could definitely see faint signs of life. As everyone was shaken in the mountain and sea butterfly, back on the first continent of planet Vast Expanse, Meng Hao strode forth, his eyes gleaming with profound light. The mastiff tagged along at his side, and moments later the parrot flew out. As soon as it saw the mastiff, it whooped in delight. "Woo, your fur is so luxuriant, it's making me horny. Damn it, why do I feel like crying?" Meng Hao didn't say anything in response. He returned to the ninth continent, and then the half-planet under the surface of the ground. Once he was back in Ninth Paragon City, he entered his secluded meditation facilities. Unfortunately, he simply couldn't shake the melancholy that had come to grip him after everything with Chu Yuyan. Some time passed, after which he subconsciously lifted his right hand and performed an incantation gesture, sending divine sense spreading out. After confirming that Perfect was doing well, he began a search for the signs of Chu Yuyan in reincarnation. She didn't reincarnate, he thought, looking off into the distance. He wasn't a completely heartless person, and although his heart was fully occupied with his desire for revenge, there were some emotions he couldn't simply ignore. In his mind, the only person he actually owed anything to in this life was Chu Yuyan. For some reason, he thought back to the coffin which existed in the vortex, which the mountain and sea butterfly rested upon. That coffin had a line of text written on it. "The entire starry sky owes me a debt, and likewise, I owe you a debt. You could awaken from slumber if you wished, but you do not." 1. The line of text on the coffin was revealed in chapter 1400. Those words and that concept formed a resonance with Meng Hao. He sat there quietly in his bitterness for a long time. Eventually, he waved his hand, and the statue of the ninth hex appeared. After examining it for a bit, determination appeared in his eyes, and he sent his divine sense out in an attempt to absorb it. However, in the instant he did that, the will of all heaven which had just been expelled descended upon him in full madness. His eyes flickered, and a vicious smile appeared on his face as he continued to absorb the ninth hex and simultaneously resist the will of all heaven. A few days later, his eyes were bright red as he reached out and pushed his hand down onto the ground. A wind blasted out, and although nothing in the area was damaged or destroyed, it fought back against the will of all heaven even more strongly. Eventually, Meng Hao's eyes were completely bloodshot. By now, he realized that if he wanted to absorb the ninth hex in peace, he simply couldn't do it here. He might be able to force it to happen, but it was also possible that along the way, he could ruin everything. Absorbing the ninth hex was too important to him, and he couldn't allow room for mistakes. After some thought, his eyes gleamed brightly. "I need a place where the will of all heaven cannot go. Only in a place like that will I be able to smoothly absorb the ninth hex. The only place I know of like that is the necropolis. It seems a little trip to the necropolis is in order. If the will of all heaven wants to get in there, it will have to fight against the necropolis and everything in it. And that includes..." Meng Hao thought about the first time he had visited the necropolis. He had heard a voice speak out from the ninth land mass, which cowed the will of all heaven with a single word. As he sat there, he examined the bronze lamp inside of him. Yet again, he could sense the feeling of worship directed at him from the ghosts. The determination in his eyes grew stronger. "To the necropolis," he said, rising to his feet. He put the wooden statue away and flickered into motion, heading toward the half-planet's teleportation portal. Once he was there, he reached out and activated the portal, causing the power of teleportation to begin to build up. Before the spell formation could fully activate, several beams of light shot through the air toward it. It was Jin Yunchen, Sha Jiudong, Bai Wuchen, the sect leader, and the other 9 essences paragons. Not a single one was missing. These people were all as crafty as foxes, and had long since begun paying close attention to Meng Hao. As soon as they detected him activating the teleportation portal, it became obvious that he was planning to go into the necropolis, and thus they appeared. They looked at Meng Hao with mixed emotions, looking shaken. The sect leader took a deep breath, then clasped hands and bowed. "Fellow Taoist Meng, would you please permit the rest of us to come along with you? We've tried on multiple occasions to enter the ninth land mass but have never succeeded. If you can open it, fellow Taoist Meng, we hope you'll give us a chance to go in too." He wasn't lying. During the past several hundred years, they had never been able to get past the eighth land mass. They had tried every method they could think of and had met with failure every time. They had finally reached the conclusion that the barrier separating them from the ninth land mass was something they would never be able to pass. Although they weren't sure why Meng Hao wanted to go into the necropolis, he was obviously completely determined to do so. After all the years they had practiced cultivation, and after everything they had experienced within the necropolis, they had developed certain speculations regarding how Meng Hao was connected to the terrifying aura they had sensed that one time on the first landmass. The opportunity they had now was not something they would abandon lightly. Not only did the sect leader clasp hands and bow, all of the other 9 essences paragons, including Sha Jiudong and Bai Wuchen, all did the same. Bai Wuchen was filled with bitterness because of it, but the prospect of transcendence prompted her to acquiesce. Only Jin Yunchen stood there, unabashed and arrogant. He waved his hand, causing a total of 30 bracelets of holding to appear, which represented virtually all of the wealth he had accumulated in recent years. Heart filled with pain, he gritted his teeth and waved his sleeve, sending the bracelets of holding flying toward Meng Hao. "That's my entrance fee," he said coolly, sticking his chin out. He was completely confident in this action and was even a bit derisive of how, even after all these years, nobody else understood Meng Hao like he did. As long as some money was thrown his way, he could accept anything. Meng Hao's face twitched as he watched the 30 bracelets of holding flying through the air toward him. He was inclined to reject such an insulting offer, but then he waved his arm, sucking the bracelets of holding into his sleeve and clearing his throat. He had to admit that, despite how much he had grown and how cold he had become, insults like this were something he was happy to accept. When the other paragons saw what was happening, they were instantly enlivened. Without any hesitation, they began to produce various precious holding items, which they handed over. Most people offered 10 or so, a few offered several dozen. Meng Hao looked them over and even scanned them with divine sense. Despite his current level of battle prowess, he was still profoundly shocked by what he saw. Both in terms of spirit stones and other precious materials, the contents were virtually impossible to count. Meng Hao couldn't prevent his heart from leaping. "I'm already at the peak of 9 essences," he murmured to himself. "The most powerful under transcendence. How could these people be so insulting?" After looking over the hundreds of precious holding items, he took a deep breath and smiled. Waving his sleeve, he collected them up, then coughed dryly. "Fellow Taoists," he said somberly, "considering how well you've cared for me in my time in the vast expanse school, I am duty-bound to take you into the necropolis with me. However, this incursion will involve great danger. If you still want to go in, though, and I'm able to open the way to the ninth landmass, then I'll do everything I can to take you with me." Everyone else smiled and nodded. They weren't worried at all about any dangers. After all the times they had been in the necropolis, they were used to that. After a final look around, Meng Hao continued to power up the spell formation with the aid of everyone else present. The speed of activation immediately increased. After a few breaths of time, the spell formation rumbled, and teleportation light shot up into the air. Even as that happened, everything on planet Vast Expanse shook. The lands quaked and the seas churned as a powerful will descended. Chapter 15:27. Vast Expanse leads the defense. The entire planet was shaking. All natural and magical laws, all space and time, all Taos, were utterly and thoroughly suppressed. The descending will became the only thing that existed in planet Vast Expanse. An endless mist spread out, such that, if you looked at the planet from a distance, it looked like it was composed of nothing but mist. The entire planet was covered by it. The will pervaded everything, like a heavenly Tao. In the blink of an eye, it appeared above the half-planet, where it attacked the teleportation portal, blocking the teleportation power. Everyone present was shocked, and couldn't help but feel that an incredible disaster was imminent. Everyone began to cry out. "What's happening? Who's attacking the spell formation? Is an army invading the Vast Expanse school? Impossible." Meng Hao's eyes flickered with killing intent. Obviously, the will of all heaven had arrived to try to prevent him from entering the necropolis. It was in that exact same moment that something like a voice echoed out within the minds of Meng Hao and the other 9 essences paragons. "Any and all teleportations are prohibited." The voice was cold, emotionless, and stern. Other than Meng Hao and the sect leader, the entire group was left trembling. Sha Jiudong, Jin Yunchen, and Bai Wuchen all coughed up blood. Everyone else seemed to be on the verge of exploding. Their bodies were being shredded to pieces, gravely injured by a single sentence. Blood oozed out of the corners of the sect leader's mouth, and Meng Hao's eyes were shot with blood, although that was the extent of his injuries. Fellow Taoists, if we don't fight back, the danger will only escalate. Meng Hao grinned viciously, waving his hand. The copper mirror appeared, instantly transforming into countless black threads. His suit of armor formed and the battle weapon appeared in his hand, which he used to slash up at the sky. A boom echoed out as all heavens descending will trembled. At the same time, an immense pressure began to weigh down. The teleportation portal itself even began to crumble apart. Everyone, regardless of whether they were inclined to or not, had no choice but to unleash the full power of their cultivation bases. An explosion of energy occurred as all of them began to fight back against the will of all heaven. Boundless essence power erupted out. Although they were being crushed by the pressure, these people were all 9 essences cultivators, with some being at the peak of 9 essences. Furthermore, all of them had benefited from 8 chances to meditate on a transcendence dais. All of them had traces of transcendence aura, which made it possible for them to resist the will which was arrayed against them. Rumbling echoed out and the spell formation trembled. The light twisted and the lands shattered. The half-planet was shaking, and more cracks were spreading out across the surface of the teleportation portal. If it broke, then it would make it very difficult for the vast expanse school forces to enter the necropolis. The entrance would be sealed tight. It was at this point that the descending will manifested in the blurry shape of a hand. The hand filled the sky as it bore down on the spell formation. Everyone, even Jin Yunchen, looked up at it in despair. It was something they simply couldn't fight against, the will of the entire starry sky of all heaven. The hand blotted out everything else, but as Meng Hao looked up at it, his eyes glittered. He considered taking out the wooden statue. He didn't want to, and in fact, the last time he had been in secluded meditation trying to absorb the 9th hex, and the will of all heaven interfered, he had only relied on his own power to fight back. As far as Meng Hao could tell, using the 9th hex before it was complete would result in irreversible losses, and would make it less effective in the future. But now it seemed he had no choice but to unleash it. However, in the very moment when he was about to do so, the sect leader threw his head back and let out an enraged roar. This is the Vast Expanse School, a branch of the Vast Expanse Society. This is the legacy of Patriarch Vast Expanse, and no one has the right to interfere with us. His hands flashed in a double-handed incantation gesture, and he pointed up into the sky. Immediately, the ground off in the distance began to quake, and an ancient aura erupted out. The instant it appeared, the hand up above trembled to a stop. Then a voice could be heard, murmuring and indistinct, and yet Meng Hao was able to make out the word being spoken. Ghost. The hand suddenly surged back into motion, moving with even greater speed than before. At the same time, a crevice opened up in the ground, from within which brilliant red light spilled out. Then, a pillar of lava exploded up, at the top of which was, unexpectedly, a turtle shell. The turtle shell radiated an ancient power which caused everything to shake violently. It was almost as if something profoundly old were underneath it, trying to escape. The turtle shell began to spin, giving rise to a tempest which spread out in all directions. As soon as the hand touched it, the tempest collapsed, and blood oozed out of the corners of the sect leader's mouth. His eyes were bright red. He was aware of the critical danger they were in, so he gritted his teeth and then roared, "Vast Expanse precious treasure, come forth." As soon as the words left his mouth, the spinning turtle shell stopped in place, and something stretched out from within it, a skeletal hand. It was completely gold, and appeared to be the hand of a cultivator. An intense and pure immortal chi emanated off of it, something which exceeded the imaginations of everyone. None of them had ever seen anything so pure and powerful, except for Meng Hao, who had made contact with a similar immortal chi when he visited the column of the immortal outside the vast expanse. As soon as the skeletal hand appeared, the bronze lamp inside of Meng Hao began to flicker wildly. Meng Hao immediately thought back to the first time he had visited planet Vast Expanse and what he had felt from the bronze lamp. Most others would not be able to discern whose hand that was, unless they were familiar with certain legends or stories. But Meng Hao was sure, based on his feelings, that this skeletal hand actually belonged to Patriarch Vast Expanse. He had been transformed from the immortal into the ghost, and was the first person in the starry sky of all heaven to transcend. He was also the first person to destroy one of all heaven's fingers. Clearly, although he had transformed into the ghost, one of his hands ended up becoming that of the immortal. He left it behind as a legacy, which became the guardian treasure of the vast expanse school. As soon as the skeletal hand appeared, the descending will of all heaven began to tremble and let out an enraged roar. The skeletal hand flew up, growing larger and larger until it was enormous and actually looked like a hand. Then, it slammed into the descending hand, which was the will of all heaven. It was like two giants crossing time and space to slam into each other directly above the teleportation portal. Rumbling sounds echoed out through planet vast expanse, causing crevices to open up throughout the lands. The hand of the will of all heaven instantly shattered into pieces, and another furious roar echoed out into the world. Everything trembled, and the half-planet seemed to be on the verge of collapsing. But then, golden light spread out from the skeletal hand, covering everything, protecting everything, ensuring that the will of all heaven could do nothing against it. In the moment that the hand formed by the will of all heaven collapsed, the teleportation portal surged into action. Rumbling echoed out, and a brilliant light shot up into the air. Meng Hao and everyone else vanished. As they did, cracking sounds emanated out from the teleportation portal. However, because of the golden light covering everything, it did not shatter. Much of it crumbled, but the main form stayed intact. The will of all heaven fell silent and then slowly faded away. At the same time, the golden light gradually receded. The golden hand shrank back down, turning skeletal once again. Then it settled back down underneath the turtle's shell, which sank back down into the ground with the lava. The crevice in the ground slowly closed back up, and everything went back to normal. When Meng Hao and the others reappeared, they were inside the necropolis. Blood was oozing out of Meng Hao's mouth, and the others were in worse shape. Expressions of lingering fear could be seen on their faces. As they thought back to the danger they had been in, their hearts quivered. If that descending hand had managed to land, not only would the teleportation portal have been destroyed, but the entire group would have been killed in body and mind. Everyone began to look over at Meng Hao. All of them could tell that the sudden developments which had occurred had something to do with him. That was especially true of the sect leader, who looked at Meng Hao with a deep and profound gaze. After a moment of silence, Meng Hao clasped hands and bowed deeply to the others. "What I have promised," he said, "I will absolutely live up to." In response, the sect leader's expression softened a bit. Another moment passed and the others nodded. "Thank you for your trouble, fellow Taoist Meng," the sect leader said. Meng Hao didn't say anything more. He took a step forward and looked out at the ruins that filled the necropolis. Casting his senses out, he confirmed that this place was almost completely devoid of the will of all heaven. Although there were faint traces, they were incredibly weak. Furthermore, the deeper one got into the 9 land masses that made up the necropolis, the more faint those traces became. In fact, the 9th land mass seemed to have no trace of the will of all heaven at all. "This is definitely the place for me to transcend," he thought. He opened his third eye and the world changed. Far off on the 9th land mass, he could see the huge throne and the figure sitting upon it. That figure's eyes opened and looked directly at Meng Hao. Chapter 1528, The Necropolis Again. "Over the past several hundred years, we've come here on numerous occasions," said the sect leader, his brow furrowed. "We know exactly how to avoid the catastrophe which strikes this place, and have the perfect place to weather the storm. However, we were never able to get past the 8th land mass. We always end up stuck at the threshold of the 9th. After all of their visits, they had never been able to come up with a method to get into the 9th land mass." Bai Wuchen stood a bit off to the side. "The entryway to the 9th land mass is a door," she said. "Only by opening that door can you enter." Meng Hao nodded in response, then began to move forward. By this point, the countless ghosts which inhabited the outer region of the necropolis began to swarm excitedly toward Meng Hao as he flew along. This was not the first time that the sect leader and the others had seen Meng Hao's power within the necropolis, but they were still shaken. That was especially true of immortal Bai Wuchen, who couldn't help but think back to the time she had been defeated by Meng Hao all those hundreds of years ago. Sighing inwardly, the group unleashed all of their power to follow Meng Hao as he flew along. Whenever they had come here on their own, they had to act with extreme prudence and caution, even in the outer area. But with Meng Hao leading them, it was exactly the opposite. With him, the monarch of the ghosts, nothing in the place could harm them at all. Everywhere they passed, rumbling could be sensed as the surrounding ghosts clustered around Meng Hao. their eyes radiating ardor and worship. It almost seemed as if Meng Hao could simply tell them to destroy themselves, and they wouldn't hesitate to comply. He looked around at the ghosts, his eyes shining with a strange light. Back when he first came here and experienced the strangeness of the ghosts, an idea had begun to form. At that time, though, even though he could control the ghosts, he felt that it was a bit unrealistic. But now, with the 9th hex on the verge of being completed, he's starting thinking about that same old idea. This time, he didn't think that it was unrealistic. In fact, he was sure that he could do it. He would take all of the ghosts in the necropolis with him as his subordinates. With them and the 9th sect, he would have a huge army that he could use to go back and destroy the 33 heavens. Of course, he wasn't underestimating the immortal god continent and the devil realm continent either. Even if he transcended, he still would never underestimate his enemies. He had some speculations about the true nature of those two enemies, but even still, he wanted to be completely prepared to face them. He was also aware that if he successfully absorbed the 9th hex and transcended, then once he left the necropolis, the will of all heaven would go mad to an unprecedented degree. His eyes flashed coldly as he proceeded along. The ghosts which surrounded them joined him as he headed toward the first land mass. When they reached the bridge, Meng Hao didn't hesitate at all. He flew across it without the slightest pause, surrounded by a sea of ghosts. Behind him, the sect leader and the others saw how different things were from their previous trips over the past several hundred years, and they smiled wryly. In all of their past trips after the first one with Meng Hao, they had always been forced to tackle that bridge with extreme caution. But now Meng Hao simply barged across it. They couldn't help but be a bit envious. "It's like this place is his home," Jin Yunqian murmured as he followed along. Even as Meng Hao was flying across the bridge, and just when he was about to step onto the first landmass, a roar echoed out from down below the bridge. It appeared as if some dark and sinister being from down below was about to leap out and block their path. Upon closer examination, they saw that it was a huge tiger, fully 300 meters long, and so black in color that it seemed to merge with the void around it. Last time Meng Hao had been here, and had fallen down into the abyss beneath the bridge, he hadn't seen anything like this tiger. He looked down and their gazes met. Then the tiger shivered. Apparently it wasn't frightened of the ghosts, but Meng Hao's gaze caused its heart to tremble. It shrank back, tail between its legs, and then vanished. Meng Hao looked away and proceeded onward to step onto the first landmass. In the past, that tiger had been a big headache for the sect leader and the others, so to see it flee like that caused them to smile wryly yet again. It was powerful, with incredible battle prowess, and the way it could merge with the void around it made all of its divine abilities and magical techniques even more effective. It was also particularly brutal in its attacks. When angered, it could unleash a storm of vengeful spirits that were incredibly fierce. Over the past hundreds of years, the sect leader and the others had been forced to expend a lot of effort to get past it across the bridge. But now, this place really is like his home, thought the sect leader, sighing inwardly. However, he was also filled with hope that this time they really might be able to make it to the 9th land mass. In fact, he had the feeling that if Meng Hao couldn't get to the 9th land mass, then no one could. After stepping back onto the first land mass, Meng Hao took a deep breath. This was his third time in the place, the first being on the initial foray into the necropolis, and the second being when he came for the copper mirror shard. "This is my third time and perhaps my last. When I leave, I will have transcended." A strange light appeared in Meng Hao's eyes as he flickered into motion. He shot forward at top speed, throwing his head back and letting loose a long cry. As he sped across the first land mass, the ghosts there all trembled and began to fly over. "It's the Emperor. The aura of the Emperor, for the third time. The Emperor is summoning us." Countless ghosts appeared in all directions. The sky trembled, and the land shook as they swirled around Meng Hao. The sect leader and the others had seen similar things happen before, and were prepared, but still couldn't help but be shaken and also slightly envious. As more and more ghosts gathered around him, he picked up speed. Anyone who could see the ghosts would have seen a vast, seemingly endless sea around him. Compared to that vast sea, the cultivators were tiny and insignificant. As for Meng Hao, he actually didn't need to fly on his own power. He simply stood there as the scintillating sea carried him along. Everything trembled as the sea of ghosts completely disregarded the passageway between the first land mass and the second. It couldn't be stopped at all, and a moment later, Meng Hao was on the second land mass. The ghosts there were equally shaken and began to swarm toward him, joining the enormous sea. The sky darkened, and everything in the world shook violently. Meng Hao waved his sleeve, and the ghosts shot toward the third land mass with indescribable speed. The sect leader and the others gasped. Although they couldn't see the ghosts, they could sense the incredible coldness and were already all starting to wonder the same thing. If things keep going on like this, then how many ghosts will he have accumulated by the time we reach the 8th land mass? The entire group exchanged shocked glances. Rumbling sounds could be heard in all heaven and earth as the boundless sea of ghosts swept Meng Hao on toward the 4th land mass. The entrance to the 4th land mass was a huge abyss filled with countless vicious eyes that seemed intent on devouring all life forms that entered. In addition to the eyes were hulking figures in crude clothing whose bodies were covered in rotting flesh. They looked like giants who had been stitched together with the skins of numerous corpses. As Meng Hao neared with the sea of ghosts, the giants roared and flew out. The eyes began to shine with red light as they too shot out of the abyss to block the path. But then they saw Meng Hao and the sea of ghosts. The giants gaped in shock, and the vicious expressions on their faces disappeared to be replaced by fear. Screaming, they retreated into the abyss at top speed. As for the eyes, they seemed even more shaken and terrified, and immediately fell back. In the blink of an eye, the sea of ghosts was sailing over the abyss onto the 4th land mass. Meng Hao didn't even look at the abyss. As for the sect leader and the others, they smiled wryly as they thought about how much effort it had taken them to get past this obstacle in the past. The same figures which had been so terrifying in the past had fled in fear this time. Chapter 15:29 Flying over the land masses. The 4th land mass was covered in ruins and looked even more wild and abandoned than the first 3 land masses. In fact, Meng Hao even spotted corpses. They were withered after all the years which had passed, and none of them were whole. They were so broken apart that it was impossible to tell which were male or female, or to determine the level of their cultivation base when they were alive. But they were a shocking sight nonetheless. As Meng Hao flew through the air over all of them, he couldn't help but recall the scene in which the finger of all heaven destroyed this world. The previous 3 land masses contain nothing but ruins, explained the sect leader, mixed emotions flickering in his eyes. There are no corpses there. The corpses show up starting in the 4th land mass. What you see here counts for almost nothing. The further in we go, the more corpses we will see. By the time we reach the 8th land mass, we will see them. Everywhere, some of them even completely intact. Considering their previous visits to this place, plus further information gleaned from the ancient records, the sect leader had a much deeper understanding of the necropolis now. You'll even see some magical items, some of which are excellently preserved. However, you mustn't allow yourself to get greedy, fellow Taoist Meng. You can't touch any of the things you see. At this point, Jin Yunchen broke in. The first time we saw such treasures, there was one individual who greedily attempted to lay hands on them. That gave rise to powerful backlash, and a terrifying force of expulsion from the entire necropolis itself. The offending person was transformed into a pool of blood in front of our very eyes. Although the fear in his eyes was clear, it was also obvious that he felt it was a pity that they couldn't take any of the treasures away with them. Meng Hao nodded. He sent his divine sense out and could feel all of the countless ghosts in the 4th land mass. This was his first time here, and almost as soon as his divine sense began to spread out, the corpses littering the ground began to tremble, and then ghosts flew out from inside of them, as well as from within the various ruins that dotted the landscape. Soon, the entire 4th land mass was teeming with activity. The scene playing out in front of them caused the sect leader and the others to look on with wide eyes. Although this wasn't anything unexpected, the intense coldness they were experiencing increased by several fold. Rumbling sounds filled heaven and earth as countless ghosts sensed Meng Hao's presence on the 4th land mass and woke up, eyes shining with madness. The aura of the Emperor. It's the Emperor. All of the ghosts on the 4th land mass took to the air and sped toward Meng Hao. As the intense, shocking coldness spread out, Meng Hao's eyes shone and he flicked his sleeve. Without pausing for a moment, he flew into motion. As he proceeded along, more ghosts from the 4th land mass streamed toward him. As soon as they caught sight of him from a distance, they would bow in worship. The sea of ghosts around him continued to grow larger and larger as he swept across the land mass. Eventually, he reached a cliff face that led to the 5th land mass. A huge statue was visible there, fully 30,000 meters tall. It was a stunning sight, like an enormous mountain that blocked the way into the 5th land mass. There is no fighting against this mountain. the sect leader said. "We spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to get into the fifth landmass. Eventually, we found that you have to wait approximately half a year. Around that time, the mountain will gradually shrink until it's only 300 meters tall. Then, at its smallest state, it can be passed with relative safety. If you try to barge past the mountain now, it will become enraged. Even considering the level of our cultivation bases, it can still pose a danger to us. After all, this statue was built back when these lands were alive and thriving, making it boundlessly powerful. Fellow Taoist Meng, I suggest we just wait here for a bit." Even though the sect leader had seen this mountain before, every time he looked at its majestic height, he was left shaken. "Half a year," Meng Hao said. "I can't wait that long." Before the sect leader could say anything else, Meng Hao's eyes flashed and he pointed at the huge mountain. "Move this mountain for me," he said coolly, bolstering his words with divine sense. The ghosts in the vast sea around him immediately began to howl and surge with energy. The aura which began to spread out left the sect leader and the others with tingling scalps. Vast quantities of ghosts surged forward toward the enormous mountain. Rumbling echoed out as it began to shake, and even rock back and forth. The sect leader and the others gasped as they noticed that, as the mountain shook back and forth, it unexpectedly began to rise slowly into the air. The lands quaked as the mountain was ripped away from them. Meng Hao could see the ghosts themselves, surrounding the mountain. Howling, they unleashed shocking power to do exactly as Meng Hao had asked, to move the mountain. Rumbling sounds filled the air as the enormous mountain continued to rise. Soon, to the shock of the sect leader and the others, it had been lifted up 30 meters above the surface of the ground. At the same time, a howl echoed out from the peak of the mountain. Countless rocks and rubble tumbled down as the mountain opened its enormous eyes. A nose appeared and then a mouth. Shockingly, the entire face became visible. It was an ancient face whose eyes radiated fury. "Who disturbs my slum, huh?" The voice contained incredible pressure and dignity, and even the power of natural law, as if it could alter heaven and earth. Before it could finish speaking, though, it suddenly fell silent. The face stared at the countless ghosts, and the boundless hostility they radiated, which was like an explosive will that shouted a single sentence. "Shut up." Lands, mountains, sky, everything was trembling. "Damn it, where did all these ghosts come from?" the face blurted. Then its mouth snapped shut. It looked at Meng Hao, its expression flickering with fear. After a moment, it closed its eyes and sank back down into the surface of the mountain, doing nothing to prevent the ghosts from moving the mountain. The sect leader's eyes were wide. The other 9 essences paragons who stood around him exchanged shocked glances. When they had come here by themselves, everything along the way required extreme caution and hard work. However, Meng Hao could disregard everything in his path. At the most, he simply had to speak a few words to resolve any situation he faced. Jin Yunshan's face twitched, and then he looked contemptuously over at the mountain. He couldn't forget what had occurred the first time they had reached this point and tried to force their way past the mountain. To their shock, it had contained power like heavenly might. Jin Yunshan's contempt grew as the mountain, apparently fearful for its safety, shrank down, making it easier for the ghosts to move it. Jin Yunshan was left completely speechless. Sha Jiudong took a deep breath, and Bai Wuchen completely abandoned any sort of unyielding attitude from years past. Soon, the mountain was completely moved out of the way and then placed down off to the side. The ghosts swept about, completely clearing the path to the fifth landmass. Meng Hao's expression was the same as ever as he flew forward. A moment later, he was on the fifth landmass. After taking a deep breath, he continued onward. From the time they had entered the necropolis until this moment, not even 10 days had passed. They sped along through the fifth landmass for a few more days. This place was even bleaker than the other land masses. Meng Hao eyed the corpses down below as he flew along toward the end of the fifth landmass, where a huge wave of water existed, completely separating the 2 land masses. This time, the sect leader didn't say anything. Considering that Meng Hao had his ghosts, he decided that the best thing for him to do was simply follow Meng Hao's lead. He was right. Meng Hao waved his sleeve and the sea of ghosts shot forward. Now that the ghosts from the fifth land mass had joined in, the sea was even more majestic than before. It slammed into the huge wave which was powerless to resist. It shattered, and Meng Hao led the ghosts flying over into the next land mass. Within 10 days, they had passed from the 6th land mass into the 7th, and after that the 8th. Meng Hao's sea of ghosts continued to grow larger. By the time they reached the 8th land mass, it was like a massive vortex swirling around him. It was so powerful that the sect leader and the others could only look on with wide eyes. There were so many ghosts swirling around in the vortex that they formed together into something that looked like an enormous, illusory ghost head which everyone could see. If that were all there were to it, it might not be a big deal. However, even more shocking was that the countless corpses on the eighth land mass rose to their feet, and their previously empty eyes seemed to burn with flame. All of them sped onward toward the border of the eighth land mass. Expand. The barrier between the eighth and ninth land masses was an enormous door, surrounded by a wall that seemed to stretch off into infinity. The sect leader and the others had never made it past this point. They had tried skirting the door by going to the left or right, but not even by traveling to the very border of the eighth land mass were they able to find a point where they could get through. The only way to proceed was to do so through this door. That was the only way to get to the ninth land mass. No matter what ideas they came up with to push open the door, no matter how much power they drew upon, it did no good. The sect leader was now looking up at it, explaining everything he knew about it to Meng Hao, including all of the ways they had failed to open it. Meng Hao stood there, surrounded by a boundless sea of ghosts who maintained complete silence, waiting there with bowed heads as he thought about the situation. A single word from him, and they would spring into action and become the fiercest of spirits, completely oblivious to their own safety. Seeing Meng Hao lost in thought, Jin Yunqian and the others didn't dare to disturb him. They had learned hundreds of years ago that in the necropolis, Meng Hao was both the monarch and the emperor. After a moment, Meng Hao burst into action. In the blink of an eye, he was directly in front of the door. In terms of size, he was like nothing compared to it, and yet the power radiating out of him caused everything shake and sent the entire surroundings into chaos. He took a deep breath as he reached out and pushed on the door. Heaven shaking, earth-shattering power erupted out. It quickly reached the peak of the 9 essences level, which exceeded the power of the second paragon and the others like him. However, it didn't stop there. It continued to rise with explosive force, surpassing Jin Yunqian, Sha Jiudong and Bai Wuqian, and causing their eyes to widen. Although they were completely aware of how terrifying Meng Hao was, it was only now that they could sense the true, astonishing level of his cultivation base. Things weren't over yet. Increasingly boundless cultivation base power exploded out. As Meng Hao's power continued to climb, he eventually exceeded even the level of the sect leader. It reached the point where he was above any and all 9 essences cultivators, and yet the door didn't so much as budge. Meng Hao frowned at the lack of reaction. Throwing all of the power he could manage at it was as good as throwing a stone ox into the ocean. Eyes flashing, he waved his right hand, and the copper mirror appeared. Black threads spread out, covering his entire body in the form of a suit of armor. With the black armor, his energy rose even higher, and a tempest sprang up around him. The sect leader and the other 9 essences experts all gasped and began to back away. They didn't come to a stop until they were several hundred meters away, where they looked at Meng Hao with fear and shock. Meng Hao was so terrifyingly powerful that they weren't sure they could fight him, even if they all joined forces. With the suit of armor, his cultivation base was at its very pinnacle. He reached out and once again shoved against the door. As far as the sect leader could remember, they had never seen the door move at all during the past several hundred years. However, as of this moment, it shuddered. Although it only lasted for a moment, it left the sect leader's mind spinning, and he began to pant in anticipation. It wasn't that he lacked willpower. Rather, after stepping into the 9 essences level, all of his dreams had become wrapped up with the hope that lay in this necropolis. Blue veins bulged on Meng Hao's face as he unleashed incredible power through his hand. The result was that the door vibrated slightly, and yet didn't move. A vicious expression appeared in Meng Hao's eyes as he raised his left hand to also push against the door. Energy blasted out in all directions, and a booming sound like that of a bell echoed out through the 8th land mass, then to the 7th, the 6th, and all the way to the 1st land mass. The door vibrated again and a cloud of dust rose up, but the door still didn't open. Meng Hao frowned. He was at the peak level of power, and yet even then couldn't open the door. That seemed to indicate that only someone who had transcended could open it. But someone who had transcended wouldn't need the altar on the 9th land mass. Therefore, the method to open the door can't relate to transcendence. There must be some other way. After some thought, Meng Hao sent his divine sense out to fill the 8th land mass. It took some time, but he managed to lock down on some of the scant will of all heaven that existed in the area. Although it was only a scrap, it was enough that it could cause problems if he tried to absorb the ninth hex. Starting from the first land mass, the will of all heaven grows weaker and weaker. Here on the eighth, there's only a tiny bit. Therefore, the ninth is likely to have none of the will of all heaven at all. That is the only place suitable to absorb the ninth hex, all the while avoiding interference from all heaven and potentially transcend. Meng Hao's eyes shone with determination, and he took a deep breath. Then, he backed up a few paces and reached out to the ghosts with his will. Break open this door. The instant Meng Hao's will transmitted those orders, the masses of ghosts raised their heads. Eyes glowing, they surged into motion, howling and roaring as they battered against the huge door. BOOMM. Waves of ghosts smashed into it, causing it to shake. Some of the ghosts who were especially gigantic and fierce slammed headfirst into the door. Rumbling echoed out, causing all heaven and earth to shake violently in the necropolis as the ghosts battered the door. It was a shocking scene. Endless streams of ghosts unleashed incredible power, causing the door to rumble and vibrate even more intensely than when Meng Hao had pushed against it. The combined power of the ghosts of all 8 of the land masses was something that even Meng Hao with his battle prowess would be fearful of. Now, it was causing the door to tremble, making it seem like opening it wasn't an impossibility after all. The sect leader and the others were completely shaken. Beyond this door was the hope they sought. It had blocked their way for hundreds of years, but now seemed like the most likely moment in which it could be opened. Jin Yunshan was the first to take action. Roaring, he unleashed his cultivation base and his essence power, reaching out with both hands to push against the door. The sect leader followed a moment later, unleashing divine abilities and essence power to create a huge hand that shoved against the door. Next was Sha Jiudong, who transformed into a sandstorm that swept out with incredible power. Then was Immortal Bai Wuchen, who summoned powerful mists. All of the other 9 essences paragons unleashed their cultivation base power. They kept nothing hidden, utilizing everything at their disposal to slam against the door. Under their combined assault, the door leading to the 9th land mass, which had blocked their path for so long, began to rumble loudly and shake visibly. It seemed as if the door might open at any moment. Meng Hao's eyes were bright red as he transformed into a huge rock which, in the blink of an eye, shot forward to slam into the door. Mountains shook and the lands quaked. The door trembled as if it might open by a sliver. However, that tiny sliver was like the difference between heaven and earth. Despite the combined assault of the entire group of cultivators, plus the endless army of ghosts, the door still didn't open. The sect leader and the others were beginning to despair. We can't open the door in this way. How do we do it? Could it really be true that only a transcendent cultivator can open it? Impossible. Why would a transcendent cultivator ever try to get to the 9th altar? In their despair, everyone was pushing as hard as they could, even coughing up blood. The ghosts emitted soundless screams. Everyone was pushing out with all the power they could muster. Meng Hao began to pant. Finally, he sent out his will via divine sense, filling the entire 8th land mass. It was like a bolt of lightning that landed upon the various corpses on the land mass, within whose eyes burned white, burning light. They began to run, faster and faster, until soon they became visible off in the distance. More and more corpses appeared, running toward the door itself, which they then began to push against. They seemed endless, and as they pushed against the door at long last, it opened up by a sliver. That completely enlivened the sect leader and the others. Meng Hao's eyes gleamed with anticipation, and he pushed forward even harder. Finally, the door opened. Meng Hao in azure rock form shot forward through the opening, followed closely by the sect leader and the others. It was with complete and utter excitement that they flew through the air at top speed. Finally, they were able to enter the 9th land mass. This was the final land mass in the necropolis, and also the location of that huge throne. Chapter 1530, the 9th land mass. Chapter 1531, Charge. Meng Hao floated above the 9th land mass, backed by the sect leader and the others, as well as the vast sea of ghosts. The 9th land mass. The sect leader threw his head back and laughed uproariously. The excitement on his face was clear. He and the others had been waiting a long time for this day. This was where lay their hope to transcend. The sect leader wasn't the only one with such feelings. Jin Yunshan, Sha Jiudong, Bai Wuchen, and all of the other 9 essences paragons were equally excited. The sect leader took a deep breath, then turned to Meng Hao, clasped hands and bowed deeply. Fellow Taoist Meng, This is a kindness I will never, ever forget. If the day comes in which you need my assistance in some matter, simply say the word." After the sect leader, Jin Yunshin, Sha Jiudong and Bai Wuchen all clasped hands and bowed as well. "I will never forget this kindness for the rest of my life. Thank you, Ninth Paragon." Their attitudes were sincere. All of the ill feelings from the past had long since dissipated, and their thankfulness toward Meng Hao was deep and genuine. Compared to the chance to stride toward transcendence, past grudges were completely insignificant. All cultivators sought to reach transcendence in the end. These three all stood at the peak of 9 essences, and therefore, the hope to transcend was the greatest yearning that existed within their hearts. They had no way to know if they would succeed or not, but as long as there was even a bit of hope, they would try. Meng Hao could see their excitement and sincerity. Their hearts lacked any desire to fight and contained no schemes or plots. Now that they had reached the 9th landmass, the hope of transcendence left them excited and profoundly thankful. Smiling, he clasped hands and bowed deeply in return. "We have all come here for transcendence," he said. "Whether or not we succeed will depend on the will of heaven, on our own good fortune, and on our own preparations. I sincerely hope that all of you succeed in transcending, fellow Taoists, and I hope that you all may walk a great Tao." Jin Yunshin took a deep breath, flicked his sleeve, and then spoke in a voice that echoed like thunder. "Forget the will of heaven and good fortune. Our success will be determined by our own preparations. Fellow Taoist Meng, if I transcend, then I will personally help you take care of your grudge with the immortal God continent and the devil realm continent. In fact, even if I do transcend, I'll still help." The sect leader laughed heartily, then echoed Jin Yunshin's words. "Count me in too." "Fellow Taoist Meng," said Sha Jiudong, "considering we've been friends for hundreds of years then, I will help too. The moment we stepped onto this land mass, our conflicts from the past vanished like smoke," said Bai Wuchen, her voice soft. "Fellow Taoist Meng, I would like to help you, sir. Thank you for giving me a chance to return home." All of the other 9 essences paragons laughed and made similar statements and promises. Meng Hao was moved. After a moment of silence, he once again clasped hands and bowed deeply to them. "Fellow Taoist Meng," said the sect leader, "let us all head to the Transcendence Dais together." Laughing, he flew up into the air, followed by the rest of the paragons. However, Meng Hao shook his head. "Why don't you go on ahead of me, fellow Taoists? Before visiting the Transcendence Dais, I need to go pay my respects to a certain individual." Meng Hao did nothing to conceal his true aim, and after he spoke, the others looked back thoughtfully for a moment. Although Meng Hao had never fully explained how he could control the Sea of Ghosts, they had long since come to certain conclusions of their own. Therefore, they all understood completely. They did nothing to convince him otherwise. After saying their goodbyes, the group shot off toward the center of the 9th land mass and the 9th Transcendence Dais. Meng Hao watched them leave, then took a deep breath. His path to transcendence was different than theirs. Although all heaven would surely attempt to stop them also, the lengths he would go to regarding Meng Hao's transcendence would be like the difference between a puddle and an ocean. Therefore, Meng Hao needed to be very careful. Although he couldn't sense any of the will of all heaven on this 9th land mass, he wanted to be prepared for all possibilities. As such, he decided that the best thing would be to go pay respects to the person who had, with a single word, prevented the will of all heaven from interfering with him on the 1st land mass. "Patriarch Vast Expanse," he murmured. With that, he burst into motion, heading toward the far end of the 9th land mass, where the huge throne was located. With every day that passed, the throne grew clearer and larger, and within Meng Hao's heart, the waves of excitement which battered him also grew larger. At a certain point, the Sea of Ghosts hadn't dared to proceed any further, and were now waiting some distance behind him, prostrated toward the person on the throne. Clearly, that person far exceeded Meng Hao as the true emperor of this place. The bronze lamp inside of Meng Hao was shining with unprecedented brightness, making him look almost as if he were made from light. As he got closer to the throne, it became clear that it had been crafted from enormous slabs of green marble. It almost looked like a mountain, rising from the very end of the 9th land mass. As for the figure seated upon it, he looked like a giant statue. Although he wasn't a flesh and blood person, he was incredibly lifelike. Even from a distance, it was possible to see the expression on his face. It was one of grief and loss. Deep within his eyes was a gleam of reminiscence. It was as if he were looking out at all the lands of the necropolis and thinking the only thing he had left, his memories of the past. He seemed lonely, a feeling which somehow seeped into Meng Hao as he neared. He stopped about 3,000 meters in front of the statue, where he looked up at it, studying it for a while before finally clasping hands and bowing deeply. The copper mirror flew out of its own volition, and the parrot appeared within it. It was uncharacteristically quiet as it looked at the statue. It appeared to be thinking about past times as it flew over and circled around the statue a few times. The grief in its eyes was clear. Meng Hao looked on. The bronze lamp inside of him was shining more brightly than ever, making Meng Hao look like a dazzling sun. Suddenly, the statue's gaze seemed to shift. Instead of looking off into the distance, it was as if he were now looking at Meng Hao, the grief in his eyes replaced by kindness. Perhaps that was just Meng Hao's imagination. Regardless, he once again bowed, then began to speak in a soft voice. Junior offers greetings, Patriarch Vast Expanse. I will never forget the kindness shown by your bronze lamp, which saved my life. Thank you also for the copper mirror, which has accompanied me for all my days. I've come here to attempt to break through to transcendence. Patriarch, I would like to request that you act as Dharma protector. After a long moment, he looked back up at the statue. After gazing deeply at it for a moment, his eyes filled with determination. As of that moment, there wasn't the slightest bit of hesitation within his heart. He would not go to the transcendence dais. That altar might be useful to the sect leader and the others, but Meng Hao had long since picked a different way to go about things. He didn't need the transcendence dais. He needed this ninth land mass, a place where all heaven couldn't interfere, or at least would have a very difficult time doing so. Meng Hao took a deep breath and sat down cross-legged. Unexpectedly, he had chosen this very spot, in front of the statue and the throne, to attempt to reach that most paramount of realms, transcendence. Transcendence was also known as the Deosaurus. It was something that countless powerful experts yearned for in their dreams. However, the number of people who had succeeded was minute. From ancient times until present, only 3 people had ever truly succeeded within the starry sky of all heaven. Meng Hao's eyes glittered as he sat there quietly, his legs crossed. After a moment he extended his right hand, and a wooden sculpture appeared, which was none other than the 9th hex. He held the statue out in front of him and opened his Tao eye, sending out powerful divine sense. The divine sense wrapped around the statue, which floated up into the air in front of Meng Hao and then began to dissolve. Meng Hao poured all of himself into the wooden statue, cutting off all connections to the outside world. He sealed off his senses as he focused utterly and thoroughly on the statue. Gradually, a shocking aura began to rise up. The 9th land mass began to tremble, and at the same time, the starry sky of all heaven outside of the necropolis filled with ripples as an enraged roar echoed out. The ripples then began to converge in the void just outside the necropolis. If anyone were standing outside to observe, they would be able to see the outline of a huge person standing there. All of the lands were shaking, as a will stretched out that could shake the world. In that same moment, the sect leader and the others were seated cross-legged on the 9th land mass altar, attempting to break through and transcend. In all their past forays into the necropolis, they had come to the realization that seeking enlightenment alone was far inferior to acting together. Therefore, the best thing to do now was join forces to seek enlightenment. Their minds were linked, making them more powerful and increasing their gains as they sought enlightenment. The result was far superior to acting alone. In the same moment that Meng Hao began to work on the 9th hex, the sect leader and the others converged their power and divine sense, causing an invisible column of qi to rise up into the air. /expand. It was actually a blessing for them to be able to make their attempt at transcendence along with Meng Hao. Normally, the first difficult step would be to deal with the will of all heaven. However, that will was now completely ignoring the sect leader and the others and was targeting Meng Hao and Meng Hao alone. Could not simply allow Meng Hao to transcend. Rumbling echoed out as the will of the starry sky of all heaven converged outside of the necropolis, and then prepared to enter it. The will of all heaven would easily be able to enter any other location, but the necropolis was not like any other location. It was a very difficult place to enter. It could expel other transcendent cultivators and could unleash that same force upon the will of all heaven. There was a boundless hatred within the necropolis, and the will of all heaven was the source and object of that hatred. Under any other circumstances, the will of all heaven would never choose to try to enter the necropolis. However, as of this moment, it was holding nothing back in its effort to do so. The entire necropolis was shaking, and cracking sounds emanated out in all directions. And yet, most of the will of all heaven was still prevented from entering. Despite its relentless bombardment, only a small portion actually manifested inside. That power instantly became a flood that surged across the first 8 land masses, transforming into an enormous hand that bore down on the ninth. However, the huge door that Meng Hao had recently moved was now back in place, and it prevented the hand from entering the ninth land mass. The hand slammed into the door, and a deafening boom rang out. The door was shaken, but refused to open, leaving the will of all heaven trapped outside. Meng Hao was completely focused on melting the wooden statue. By now, about half of it was gone, having transformed into tiny drops of black fluid, each of which contained sealing marks. Eventually, when the entire statue was dissolved, and the black drops of fluid were absorbed into Meng Hao, he would be able to combine them into a sealing mark within his soul. And that would be the ninth hex. Currently, he was still working on the first step of that process. By now, rumbling sounds had filled the necropolis as the will of all heaven repeatedly failed to batter its way inside. Finally, a roar of rage echoed out through the starry sky of all heaven, causing asteroids in numerous locations to begin to tremble and shake. Then, they were instantly teleported away. Billions upon billions of asteroids then began to crash into each other, merge together, and then shrink down. Within the space of a few breaths of time, all of the asteroids which dotted the starry sky of all heaven vanished from their original positions and began to merge together. Under the control of the will of all heaven, they began to form 9 enormous spikes. Each of the 9 spikes was fully 3 million meters long, and completely astonishing in appearance as they hovered within the void outside the necropolis. Then the will of all heaven split apart and fused into the 9 spikes. A moment later, intense energy erupted off of the spikes, and rumbling sounds could be heard as they shot toward the necropolis. The necropolis shuddered, incapable of resisting. Cracking sounds echoed out as the first spike pierced through the necropolis defenses, destroying the sky as it shot toward the first land mass, a blur of light. As it descended, the expulsion power targeting the will of all heaven grew even stronger. The spike fought back fiercely, causing flames to burst out all over it. Soon, it began to crumble and shrink down until it was only 300,000 meters long and no longer sharp. In the end, it was simply a gigantic asteroid hurtling down toward the first land mass. When it made contact with the ground, everything shook and massive crevices spread out. Next came the second spike, the third, and the fourth, which pierced through the defenses to descend toward the second, third, and fourth land masses respectively. They also burst into flames, shrinking down rapidly as they sailed past the first land mass. Of course, the deeper they got into the necropolis, the stronger the resistance they faced. Rumbling sounds echoed out as the 3 asteroids closed in on their targets. The asteroid that landed on the second land mass was only 150,000 meters wide. The one that landed on the third land mass was only 60,000 meters wide. And as for the fourth, it was only 30,000 meters wide. What a significant loss in power. However, things weren't over. The 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th spikes tore through the sky, destroying the necropolis defenses as they hurtled toward the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th land masses. The sky of the necropolis was completely obliterated, and yet the will of all heaven still had incredible difficulty entering the necropolis. The lands quaked as the spikes burned, getting smaller and smaller the further they got into the necropolis. The asteroid that landed on the 5th land mass was less than 30,000 meters wide. The 6th asteroid was 15,000 meters wide. By the time the 8th asteroid hit, it was only 3,000 meters wide. And then there was the 9th spike. By the time it reached the 9th land mass, the flames had reduced it to nothing more than ash, and it couldn't enter. Moments ago, the sculpture in front of Meng Hao was about 70% dissolved, and he was surrounded by scintillating drops of black fluid. Only a short bit of time remained before it would be completely dissolved. Meng Hao was trembling. He couldn't sense what was happening on the outside, but could well guess that the will of all heaven was going to any and all lengths to try to stop him. Therefore, he focused all of his divine sense on dissolving the statue. Faster, must go faster. Blue veins popped out on his face as he fought to take advantage of every second of time available to him. It was at this point that he heard a massive boom coming from the first land mass. As the first asteroid smashed into the ground, a figure appeared from within the rubble. He was humanoid but had no facial features. He was almost just an outline. He looked up at the 9th land mass, then took a single step forward, causing him to blur into motion. Only moments later, the 2nd and 3rd asteroids exploded, and even as the ash drifted out, figures appeared from within them as well. The same thing happened on the 5th through 8th land masses. All of the figures which appeared began to walk toward the 9th landmass, although the one which had come from within the first 300,000-meter asteroid was the fastest. His first step took him onto the 2nd landmass, where he merged together with the figure which had stepped out of the 2nd asteroid. As soon as that happened, he changed, becoming less blurry and indistinguishable. Then, he took a second step. The second step placed him on the 3rd landmass, where he merged with the 3rd figure. Now his facial features could be seen, and he looked like a young man. He didn't stop there. Each step he took brought him to another of the land masses. On the 4th, 5th, and all the way to the 8th land mass, he absorbed the other figures, until he was standing there on the 8th land mass, looking up at the enormous door. By that point, everything about him was clearly visible. He was a young man with long black hair, dressed in a long blue robe. He was exceedingly handsome, with an expression that was calm, yet simultaneously cold and indifferent. Unexpectedly, a closer look revealed that he looked exactly like the statue of the man seated on the throne on the 9th land mass. All ye living beings in the vast expanse art my children. This place is the necropolis of the ghost, thence I take his appearance. This young man, who could take the form of anything which existed in the starry sky of all heaven, extended his right hand and pushed onto the door, whereupon it swung open. Then he took another step and was on the 9th land mass. Almost instantly, a shocking force of expulsion hit him, pushing him back slightly. His expression was the same as ever as he began to walk forward, despite the power of expulsion. Although it was a monumental effort, none of that showed on his face. Another step, and he appeared by the Transcendence dais. He looked over at the sect leader and the others, and then waved his right hand. A boom echoed out, and the Transcendence dais shook. The sect leader and the others all coughed up mouthfuls of blood, and their efforts at transcendence were broken. There were even some of the weaker 9 essences paragons who let out blood-curdling screams as they exploded, killed in body and soul. Everyone else was astonished. Even as they looked over at the young man, he took another step, taking him to the position of the enormous statue. There, the boundless sea of ghosts all turned and looked at him, their expressions blank. However, that blankness only lasted for a moment before it was replaced by madness and hatred. It didn't matter that the will of all heaven had taken the form of Patriarch Vast Expanse. That couldn't change the aura which emanated off of him, and these ghosts hated that aura with a vengeance that would last for all eternity. They surged into motion with a howl of fury. The enmity which came from their deaths, and which had transformed them into angry ghosts, would never dissipate. Now, they leapt into action, charging toward the young man that was the embodiment of the will of all heaven. "O ye my children," the young man said coolly, "dead are ye, and yet ye persist in wickedness. Thence I strip ye of your bodies of reincarnation and strip ye of your power of movement." His face was completely and utterly expressionless, and he didn't even seem to look at the ghosts. He took another step forward, completely focused on the person sitting there cross-legged, dissolving the wooden statue. Chapter 1532, All ye living beings art my sons. Chapter 1533, Dissolving the Hex. This was not the first time that the will of the starry sky had made a move on Meng Hao. However, this was its first time taking such a form in his presence. However, Meng Hao currently couldn't see that. All of his senses were sealed as he focused completely on the task at hand. He had to dissolve the wooden statue as soon as possible. By this point, the statue was almost 80% dissolved. Soon, that number would reach 90%. Only 10% to go. Must go faster. Meng Hao's divine sense was exploding out to a level that made it almost impossible to sustain as he tried to dissolve the statue even faster. It was in that exact same moment that the embodiment of the will of all heaven pierced through the boundless sea of ghosts. Strangely, when the ghosts tried to approach the will of all heaven, they suddenly came to a halt, as if they had lost the ability to move. In the blink of an eye, all of the ghosts began to tremble and then cease all movement. Their eyes went wide as though it wasn't just their bodies, but also their spirits and their simplistic ghostly minds were suddenly stripped of the power of movement. The embodiment of the will of all heaven took another step, putting him directly in front of Meng Hao. He looked down, and his expression flickered as though he were befuddled or confused. "Why are you unwilling to merge with me?" he asked coolly. Then he reached out to tap on Meng Hao's forehead. However, it was in that moment that a piercing cry suddenly rang out. The parrot appeared, flashing through the air to pierce directly through the chest of the embodiment of all heaven. The embodiment paused for a moment, and then prepared to continue moving his finger toward Meng Hao. But then a voice rang out, speaking a single word that caused everything to tremble violently. "Begone!" The words came out of the mouth of the huge statue. They filled the world, creating a powerful tempest which shook the entire necropolis. The embodiment of the will of all heaven began to tremble, then staggered backward as if he couldn't control his own body. When he was about 30 meters away from Meng Hao, his flesh exploded, sending blood and gore splattering out in all directions. The skin and muscle of his body was almost completely destroyed, revealing the bones underneath. Only half of his head remained intact. As the voice which had just spoken faded away, the embodiment of the will of all heaven slowly looked up. His wounds rapidly healed, and in the blink of an eye, he was back to normal. In that same moment, there was a world out in the starry sky of the vast expanse, in which all of the life forms suddenly withered up. Their blood and life force vanished, and the entire world instantly became as still as death. It was that very power of blood and life force which allowed the embodiment of the will of all heaven to recover. As he looked up at the statue, his expression flickered again. He seemed confused, even dazed. "So it's you, my eldest son," he said coolly. An incisive gleam appeared within the eyes of the figure on the throne. Massive rumbling sounds echoed out as the statue slowly rose to its feet amidst a cascade of falling rocks and rubble. The falling stones and rubble soon formed a small mountain, from within which emerged a young man. He looked exactly like the embodiment of the will of all heaven, without a single difference. However, his body clearly wasn't made of flesh and blood. This wasn't the true patriarch Vast Expanse, but rather a clone, which he had left behind inside the necropolis to reminisce and guard the place. When he emerged, the sky shook and the lands quaked, and the entire ninth land mass seemed to be on the verge of collapsing. Patriarch Vast Expanse's clone took a step forward, placing him directly in front of Meng Hao, separating him from the embodiment of the will of all heaven. He didn't speak, nor did his expression change in any way. He waved his right sleeve out in front of him, and an aura exploded out that seemed like both immortal and ghost, and yet was neither. A black mist sprang up, which was filled with countless vicious ghosts. It immediately engulfed the embodiment of all heaven. The embodiment waved his right finger, which caused the natural and magical laws of the world to form together. A boundless, indescribable will then erupted out. At this point the embodiment of all heaven said, "In front of me, all powers within the vast expanse shall be either stripped away or absorbed." The vicious ghosts within the black mist began to tremble, then faded away, as if they were being erased from existence. However, in the moment before they were about to be completely wiped away, the clone of Patriarch Vast Expanse let out a cold harumph. Instantly, the black mist sank down on itself, and the vicious ghosts converged together to form a single vicious ghost, astonishing in appearance. It had black mist for skin and looked like the most vicious of spirits. Most shocking of all was how it stooped over at the waist, making it seem almost hunchbacked in appearance. Shockingly, the reason for that was because it carried a world on its shoulders. Countless buildings could be seen, which resembled Yama King palaces. As for the ghost's arms and legs, they were wrapped and bound by countless black chains. The ghost roared, and power of natural law erupted from the world on its back. That power was something that not even the embodiment of all heaven could strip away. That was the power of Patriarch Vast Expanse, the power of the ghost. That power caused an explosive force of expulsion to blast into the embodiment of all heaven. The will of all heaven sighed as his body was shredded into a haze of blood. However, he didn't seem to care. He raised his right hand and pointed out with his finger, causing intense gray light to shoot out in all directions. At the same time, the air behind him ripped open, revealing a single finger. It was a finger which could supersede a world, which could exceed the heavens. As soon as it appeared, the finger reached out to slam into the vicious ghost. BOOMM. Beneath the power of the finger, the ghost trembled and then began to fall to pieces. The buildings on its back vanished into smoke, crushed like dried weeds. However, at the same time, the chains which covered its limbs wrapped around the finger, binding it tighter and tighter until it exploded. Apparently, they were evenly matched. As the sound of the explosion echoed out, the embodiment and the clone staggered backward away from each other. Patriarch Vast Expanse's clone slowly looked up and in a voice both hoarse and ancient said, "You're not taking this kid away." A powerful pressure spread out from him, which instantly began to crush down onto the will of all heaven. It didn't matter that the embodiment represented the entire starry sky of all heaven. The clone of Patriarch Vast Expanse didn't show any fear of it whatsoever. The embodiment of all heaven looked expressionlessly at Patriarch Vast Expanse's clone, then said, "O my eldest son, you have already departed. What need is there to remain so obsessed?" With that, he extended his right hand and pointed out with his finger. "Power," he said. Instantly, explosive power radiated out from him, transforming into an enormous magical symbol, which was in itself covered with even more magical symbols. This symbol represented the natural law of the Tao of power within the starry sky of the vast expanse. This was something that not even 9 essences cultivators could do. It was a magical symbol formed from magical symbols, and as soon as it appeared, it bore down on Meng Hao and Patriarch Vast Expanse's clone. At this point, all magical laws within the starry sky of all heaven that had to do with power suddenly faded. They were weakened to form the huge magical symbol which was currently slashing down in attack. Patriarch Vast Expanse's clone looked on with glittering eyes. He suddenly performed an incantation gesture with his right hand, causing his entire hand to fade. No blood or flesh was visible, neither any bone, only a spectral arm. It was not black but multicolored, and it emanated a Tao, a personal Tao that came when one became an essence. It was the ghost Tao of Patriarch Vast Expanse. When his hand made contact with the magical symbol, heaven shook and the earth trembled. The lands cracked and split as a shockwave blasted out, shaking the entire necropolis. By this point, the sculpture in front of Meng Hao was 90% dissolved. The final 10% continued to melt rapidly. Soon 94% was dissolved, then 97, 98, until finally 100%. It was completely dissolved and the statue no longer present. It now existed as 100 drops of black liquid, no more, no less. In that very moment, Meng Hao's senses, which had been sealed completely shut, suddenly opened. His eyes glowed brightly despite the terrifying fluctuations emanating off of the will of all heaven. No matter how much that will wanted to kill him, Patriarch Vast Expanse's clone made it impossible. It was now filled with an intense rage and fury that could only come from being in Meng Hao's presence. Meng Hao took a deep breath, and as he did, the 100 drops of black liquid transformed into beams of light that shot into his forehead. Sounds like rumbling thunder filled his mind, as though 100 black bolts of lightning were striking his head. When the last one merged into his forehead, and the final thunderclap rang out, a power that could end the heavens and crush the earth rose up in his sea of consciousness. He began to tremble violently, and a mouthful of frothy blood exploded out of his mouth. The 100 drops of black liquid swirled together within his sea of consciousness, and as they did, the aura of the 9th hex began to emanate out. Although it wasn't complete yet, the moment it exploded out, the embodiment of the will of all heaven shivered. An expression of fiery rage appeared on his face, and his eyes erupted with killing intent. "Screw off," he roared, launching himself toward Patriarch Vast Expanse's clone. Chapter 1534, Fuse with Me. Rumbling echoed out, and simultaneously, Patriarch Vast Expanse's clone laughed. He didn't back down even for a moment. Black mist swirled as he once again shot forward to block the path of the embodiment of the will of all heaven. Behind him, Meng Hao was trembling as the aura of the 9th hex exploded out from within him. Even as he shook, the necropolis also trembled, causing boundless ripples to spread out into the starry sky of all heaven outside. At the same time, within Meng Hao's sea of consciousness, the 100 drops of black liquid were rapidly forming a shape. 10%, 20%, 30%, 40%. In the blink of an eye, it reached a state of 70% completion. As it did, the complete outline of the 9th hex began to appear. 80%, 90%. Before the will of all heaven could do anything to stop him, Meng Hao closed his eyes yet again. At the same time, a rumbling sound began to fill him, a sound so shocking it could shake heaven and earth. Thunder and lightning boomed in the outside world as well, and although that occurred within the starry sky of all heaven, it was not caused by the vast expanse. Instead, it was caused by the 9th hex. It was heaven sealing lightning. Within Meng Hao's sea of consciousness, the black liquid had formed into something that caused the starry sky of all heaven to tremble. The 9th hex. The seal the heavens hex. In the instant that it appeared, the world of the necropolis shook violently, sending shockwaves out in the starry sky outside. Everything which existed, all living beings, felt themselves trembling, filled with indescribable astonishment. Apparently, something new had come to exist within the heavens above, a naturally occurring enemy of heaven. Apparently, there was a new will which existed in the starry sky of the vast expanse. Apparently, within the countless worlds of reality, there was a new natural law. It was the seal the heavens hex, a Tao which existed above all other laws. R-U-M-M-M-B-L-L-L-E. As the intense rumbling sound echoed out, Meng Hao took a deep breath. Then his eyes snapped open. He had completed the first step on his path to transcendence. He had fully absorbed the ninth hex, which had been formed by the accumulation of the 9 incarnations of his clone. They were now an inseparable part of him, completely and utterly part of Meng Hao. However, that was only the first step. Meng Hao was acutely aware that time was of the essence, and that he needed to take the second step as soon as possible. That second step was 9 hexes combine, Meng Hao said. As soon as the words left his mouth, all surrounding natural and magical laws shattered, as if they simply couldn't stand up to the domineering existence of the 9 hexes. In the moment that Meng Hao prepared to combine the 9 hexes, the embodiment of the will of all heaven looked on with widening eyes. A bright light began to shine within those eyes, and at the same time, the void outside of the vast expanse began to twist and distort, as a huge eye appeared. The eye slowly began to open, and when it reached the halfway point, a shockingly powerful will began to surge out from it, its target being Meng Hao. It wanted to prevent him from transcending. However, it was at this point that, without any warning, a person appeared in front of the eye. It was a young man with white hair and a cold expression. Furthermore, it was possible to tell that this was a clone, not this person's true self. The clone looked like Slaughter, as well as the young man who had appeared outside of the immortal god continent, the transcendent cultivator. He reached out and placed his hand onto the huge eye, preventing it from opening any further. A tremor ran through the eye and a roar of rage could be heard. Then, within the boundless void outside the vast expanse, a second figure appeared. He was also a young man, and he radiated a sinister aura of death. He had long, violet hair, and his eyes seemed to shine with starlight. His expression was calm as he hovered there, staring at the boundless eye. As the eye struggled to open, an enraged voice roared, "You people failed back then. You do not qualify to try to eradicate me. You might have become more powerful since then, but you do not qualify to stand in my way." Everything in the area began to tremble and shatter. However, the 2 young men didn't seem ruffled at all. "The fellow Taoist who can wipe you out is currently transcending. We might have lost our qualifications, but we can still stop you from interfering." The eye remained half open, mysterious light glittering within. Meanwhile, back in the necropolis, the embodiment of the will of all heaven gritted his teeth. Eyes gleaming with ferocity, he ceased his attempts to call upon power from outside the vast expanse, and instead focused on drawing upon the power within the starry sky of the vast expanse. Within the depths of the starry sky were numerous vortexes which housed various worlds and realms. Within thousands of those locations, blood-curdling screams echoed out as the living beings there withered up. Their flesh and blood, along with their life force, was all sucked away. It wasn't just the life forms within those locations. The worlds themselves were all transformed into ash, their world essences sucked away. Thousands of worlds were gone in the blink of an eye, completely wiped out of existence. There were even entire regions near the border of the starry sky of all heaven, which withered away as if they had just died. Most shocking of all was that the energy of heaven and earth within the starry sky was suddenly reduced by 30%. If it were reduced by any more than that, the entire vast expanse would collapse. It was a limit which apparently couldn't be passed. All of that power was absorbed by the embodiment of the will of all heaven. It took a single thought to accomplish, and then an indescribable power converged outside of the necropolis and began to tear it open. The sky of the necropolis was completely destroyed, revealing the starry sky of the vast expanse beyond. The will of all heaven descended in full, completely destroying the first landmass. Next was the second, third, fourth, and in fact, all of the landmasses except for the ninth. Everything was transformed into rubble by the will of all heaven. The descending will of all heaven was like a flood of water. In the blink of an eye, it converged onto its embodiment. Instantly, that embodiment's features twisted and changed. 6 more arms sprouted out of its body, giving it a total of 8. Furthermore, 3 heads emerged. It had a total of 4 heads and 8 arms. A roar of rage transformed into a powerful sound wave that blasted into the 9th landmass, causing it to tremble violently. Patriarch Vast Expanse's clone looked on with widening eyes. "I am all heaven," said the 4-headed, 8-armed figure, its voice echoing like thunder. At the same time, its body began to grow blurry, revealing something completely unexpected inside: countless stars, planets, vortexes, and worlds. It was as if the entire starry sky of the vast expanse had become its body. It was using the full power of the starry sky to try to wipe out the clone of Patriarch Vast Expanse. It would destroy that clone, then wipe out Meng Hao to prevent him from transcending and bring everything back under its control. Patriarch Vast Expanse had only left a clone behind here. However, because of the bronze lamp inside of Meng Hao, that clone chose to help him. With that bronze lamp, Meng Hao became the legacy successor of Patriarch Vast Expanse. That legacy was a legacy, not of the cultivation base or the bloodline, but rather of thought. It was a continuity of thought, a desire to destroy the will of the starry sky of the vast expanse. Because they both harbored that intent, the clone chose to help Meng Hao. However, it was only a clone. The real Patriarch Vast Expanse was a figure from countless years in the past. It was impossible to say where he was now. As for his clone, he could hold out for a while against the will of all heaven, but considering how madly that will was fighting, sparing no cost to win, it meant that the clone was reaching its limit. And yet it continued to stand against the attack. It was falling apart into destruction, but it knew that if it were completely destroyed, then Meng Hao, who was still in the midst of his effort to combine the 9 hexes, would be facing grave danger. In this critical moment, the clone's eyes suddenly flickered. His right hand shot out toward Meng Hao and made a grasping motion. What it was beckoning to, though, was not Meng Hao but the parrot. The parrot blurred into motion, transforming into the battle weapon, which the clone grabbed and slashed out into the air. Heaven shook and the earth trembled. A huge rift opened up, which erupted with the explosive power of time travel. That power became a windstorm which swept out to cover the 9th land mass, as well as the rest of the crumbling necropolis. Time was being reversed. Instantly 10,000 years passed, then 100,000 years, 1,000,000 years. Endless years blurred by in a tempest, and when everything became clear again, the world was completely different. The sky was now bright blue, and the 8 destroyed land masses were restored. Countless cultivators could be seen flying here and there. It was a bustling, flourishing place. A gentle breeze blew, as the lands of the necropolis returned to ancient times. The sect leader and the others gasped in response. However, it wasn't a huge shock, considering that they had seen similar things occur in the past. Every time the necropolis experienced the apocalyptic catastrophe, it returned to ancient times, when the will of all heaven destroyed the world. However, this time it was the clone of Patriarch Vast Expanse who had reversed time, taking all of the memories of the apocalypse which existed in the necropolis and unleashing them early. With that, the clone took a deep breath and then stabbed the battle weapon down into the ground. Rumbling echoed out as the clone's divine sense filled all the lands with a single thought. And that thought was, destroy the starry sky of the vast expanse.